support services. Second, you will consider a third report and order on reconsideration, and fourth, further notice of proposed rulemaking that would continue the Commission's work to combat unwanted and illegal calls and implement portions of the Traced Act. Third, you will consider a declaratory ruling, and second, further notice of proposed rulemaking that would integrate provisions of the recently enacted Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act of 2019 into the Commission's existing supply chain rulemaking proceeding. Fourth, you will consider a sixth report and order on reconsideration that would further the Commission's efforts to improve vertical or Z access location accuracy for wireless 911 calls, which would help first responders quickly locate people calling for help from multi-story buildings. Fifth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment on streamlining and updating Commission rules to ensure that priority service programs operate effectively for emergency workers as technology evolves. Sixth, you will consider a second report and order that would modernize the least access rate formula by adopting a tier-based calculation. Seventh, you will consider a report and order and third, further notice of proposed rulemaking that would establish rules for collecting granular and precise data on the availability of fixed and mobile broadband service through the Digital Opportunity Data Collection, and would seek comment on additional measures to implement the requirements of the Broadband Data Act. This is your agenda for today. The first item, entitled Implementation of the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act of 2018, will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. And before I turn it over to Ms. Monteith, let me extend my gratitude to Jeff Reardon at the FCC for setting up this Microsoft Teams meeting in a way that allows us to conduct our business virtually. Jeff, thank you for everything that you have done. Ms. Monteith, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and commissioners. The Wireline Competition Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration a report and order that would designate 988 as the three-digit dialing code for a national suicide prevention and mental health crisis hotline. I would like to thank the Bureau team for their hard work on this item, as well as our colleagues in the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Office of General Counsel for their helpful input. I also would like to thank our federal partners at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and the United States Department of Veterans Affairs for their close coordination. I would like now to introduce Dr. McCants Katz, Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use, and ask that she turn on her video feed. As the Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use, Dr. McCants Katz advises the HHS Secretary on improving behavioral health care in America and leads the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in HHS. Previously, she served as the first Chief Medical Officer for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Dr. McCants Katz, if you would like to share some remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning. In my role as the Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use, it is my job to lead the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, but I'm also a psychiatrist. And throughout my career, and especially in my current role, the prevention of suicide has always been a key priority. We lose far too many Americans each year to suicide, with over 47,000 lives lost in 2018, approximately that same number as we lose for opioid overdose deaths, and yet we hear relatively little about this critically important issue. And unfortunately, though suicide is the 10th leading cause of death among Americans, very few resources are made available to address this situation, either at a national level or a local level. That's why today marks such an important step. I want to thank the FCC for your efforts since the passage of the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act to advance the adoption of the national 3-digit number for suicide prevention, and for working so closely with SAMHSA and with the Veterans Administration on this milestone for suicide prevention in the United States. One of the important tools we have to achieve the goal of suicide prevention at SAMHSA is our National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. This lifeline, a network of 170 crisis centers across the United States, aims to do just as its name suggests, provide a lifeline to those who may believe they no longer have one. The lifeline provides 24/7 support from trained crisis counselors to callers who may be experiencing suicidal thoughts, have suicide plans, or are experiencing great anxiety and stress. In 2019, the lifeline provided support to over 2.2 million callers. If an individual or a loved one is experiencing intense emotional distress, the last thing we want is the stress of having to remember a long phone number to reach help. This can be a barrier to reaching out for support. Just as a person experiencing a medical emergency is likely to remember that 911 is the number to call, we hope that any American in suicidal crisis will come to know that 988 is the number to call for immediate help and assistance. With the implementation of 988, we anticipate that many more Americans will call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and that many more lives will be saved as a result. Lifeline's crisis centers are in many ways the nation's mental health safety net, and the adoption of the 988 number will make it easier to reach these centers. The 988 number will also make it easier for veterans, service members, and their families to reach the lifeline and to press 1 for the Veterans Crisis Line. SAMHSA is also grateful for the FCC's recognition that the promise of the 988 number to be fully realized will require enhanced capacity for the crisis centers for those who answer the calls. If a caller is in a suicidal crisis, every minute can be critical, and it's crucial that the caller is connected rapidly to needed help. Only if every call can be answered promptly and effectively, with follow-up and linkage to needed mental health and other services, will the critical role that 988 can play in reducing suicide be fully realized. SAMHSA looks forward to continuing to work over the next 2 years with the FCC, the VA, and the community crisis centers upon whose shoulders the Lifeline Network is built to achieve this transformation in crisis care and suicide prevention in America. The current situation across our country, increased social isolation, loneliness, unemployment, and anxiety sheds an even stronger light on how very important it is to ensure ease of access and help. The tragedy of suicide befalls too many families and communities, and I'm very hopeful that with our collective efforts and the implementation of this 3-digit number, we can save many individuals and families from experiencing the pain caused by suicide. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today, and thank you again for this important initiative.
Thank you, Dr. McCants-Katz. I would ask that you now disable your video feed, and I would like next to introduce Dr. David Carroll, Executive Director of the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention. Dr. Carroll, if you would please turn on your video feed. I see him there. Great. As the Executive Director, Dr. Carroll is responsible for the leadership, development, implementation, and operational integrity of VA programs that provide veterans access to a full continuum of integrated mental health care and suicide prevention services. As a leader in innovation, he has advanced integrated whole health care, led a robust adoption of telemental health services, coordinated services across the VA and with community partners, improved consistency in care delivery, and spread best practices. Dr. Carroll, if you would like to share a few words.
Thank you and good morning. And thank you, Chairman and Commissioners, for the opportunity to speak with you today. The Department of Veterans Affairs is proud to support the 988 expansion initiative, alongside our partners such as the Federal Communications Commission, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And I would like to reinforce and echo all of the opening remarks that Dr. McCants-Katz provided. This is such an important initiative, and we are so proud and pleased to support this and appreciate your support for this as well. Once activated, the 988 expansion will directly address the need for ease of access and clarity in times of crisis, both for veterans and non-veterans, by providing a universal, unique, easily remembered 3-digit dialing code. It will give the Department of Veterans Affairs the opportunity to work in greater collaboration alongside the entire suicide prevention community across the United States. It will give all of us a way to improve the way we engage individuals in life-saving services and care. The VA looks forward to continued focus around expanded access to quality crisis care for veteran service members and their families through the Veterans Crisis Line and our partnership with Lifeline. For now, the Veterans Crisis Line remains available 24/7 by calling 1-800-273-8255, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and then pressing 1, or chatting online at veteranscrisisline.net or texting 838255. And after 988 implementation, veterans and service members will still press 1 to reach the Veterans Crisis Line. The 988 initiative is also aligned to the President's roadmap to empower veterans and end a national tragedy of suicide, the work of the Prevents Task Force. The Prevents Task Force is a nationwide initiative to raise awareness about mental health, connect veterans and all Americans at risk of suicide to federal and local resources, and to engage everyone in healthy living, resilience, and wellness. This is such an important initiative. It is an incredibly important tool that we are eager to add to the resources that are available. Thank you for your consideration of the 988 expansion initiative, and VA stands ready to support its implementation along with our other federal partners and colleagues across the country. Thank you, and this concludes my remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carroll. Presenting the item today from the Wireline Competition Bureau's Competition Policy Division is Jesse Goodwin, Attorney Advisor. Jesse?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Now more than ever, Americans need rapid access to suicide prevention and mental health crisis intervention services. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. In 2018, suicide claimed the lives of more than 48,000 Americans, with 1 death every 11 minutes. Additionally, 10.7 million adults in the United States seriously thought about suicide. 3.3 million made a plan to commit suicide, and 1.4 million attempted suicide. Suicide also disproportionately impacts various at-risk populations. For example, more than 20 veterans die by suicide every day, and over 6,000 veterans committed suicide each year between 2008 and 2017. LGBTQ young adults ages 18 to 25 contemplate suicide at a rate more than 4 times higher than their non-LGBTQ peers, and more than 1.8 million LGBTQ youth between the ages of 13 and 24 seriously consider suicide each year. A 2019 study found that self-reported suicide among African American teens increased by 73% between 1991 and 2017. The report and order would designate 988 as the 3-digit code for a national suicide prevention and mental health crisis hotline. Callers dialing 988 would be routed to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which can be reached today by dialing 1-800-273-8255 or 1-800-273-TALK. The order would find that designating a 3-digit dialing code will increase, simplify, and improve access to the lifeline and enhance public awareness of mental health services, and reduce the stigma surrounding suicide and mental health issues. The order finds that using 988 is less technically complicated than other numbers, as it is not in use as a geographic area code, which likely reduces the time needed for implementation. Further, the order would find that using a wholly unique 3-digit code would be less disruptive to existing users and service providers, making consumer education simpler and more effective, whereas many N11 codes are heavily used and repurposing them would take significant time and resources. To ensure ubiquitous deployment of 988, the report and order would require all telecommunications carriers, interconnected voice over internet protocol or VoIP providers, and one-way VoIP providers to implement 988 by July 16, 2022. Additionally, the report and order would require all covered providers to implement 10-digit dialing in areas that both use 7-digit dialing and 988 as the first 3 numbers of a 7-digit telephone number. The order finds that requiring 10-digit dialing is the simpler and less costly approach for 988 implementation and will provide 988 callers with a more reliable connection to the resources they need when compared with a dialing delay, which risks confusion and misdirected calls. The order would also set a single implementation deadline to avoid confusion about when 988 is available and to eliminate disparities, whether in terms of where a person lives or what kind of technology they use, in access to 988. The Bureau recommends adoption of this report and order and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that presentation. And I also want to thank our presenters, Dr. McCants-Katz from SAMHSA, as well as Dr. Carroll from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Thank you for your advocacy on this issue and for your agency's partnership with the FCC. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With rising suicide rates and COVID-19 compromising the mental health of so many Americans, this item is especially applicable to the times in which we live. And I applaud the chairman for advancing the will of Congress in the Suicide Hotline Improvement Act through this proceeding. While I'm somewhat skeptical about the certain assumptions in the item's analysis of costs and benefits, I am hopeful that our actions today will be effective in preserving sacred human lives. Because there is so much at stake, we need to get the item exactly right. That includes making sure there aren't misunderstandings over the timeline for rolling out deployment of 988. While I understand the urge to publicize actions we're taking, doing so shouldn't come at the risk of confusing consumers and vulnerable individuals in need of service. We can and should celebrate the work that's been done by individuals involved in this effort, including those on Capitol Hill, without giving a false promise to the public that 988 is actually operational. So let's be clear in all of our communications that deploying 988 will take time and isn't a matter of simply pulling a proverbial switch. In fact, it will require providers, particularly legacy wireline companies, to replace, update, or otherwise alter thousands of literal switches at their own expense, and 87 area codes will need to transition to 10-digit dialing. Even in the best of circumstances, such transitions can be challenging and lengthy, requiring consumer education, end user equipment upgrades by enterprise and governmental entities, and coordination with state public utility commissions, among other challenges. Acknowledging the work ahead doesn't diminish the extensive work that's already been done to arrive at this point. It just reflects the reality of the transition. Similarly, I'm sympathetic to the fact that we are placing a burden on providers to deploy 988, who will face many obstacles that are beyond their control. I very much appreciate that the chairman's office was willing to work with me to acknowledge and mitigate some of these challenges. For example, holding the North American Numbering Plan Administrator accountable to its obligations and demanding time-sensitive deliveries should help us move the process along. However, in some cases, transitioning to 10-digit dialing may not be possible within our time frame, and I'm grateful that the draft is more sensitive to the job ahead than the one initially circulated. I also want to acknowledge that to the extent that we decline to establish a cost recovery mechanism for implementation of 988, we're essentially imposing an unfunded mandate on providers. While there are absolutely maybe good policy reasons for requiring providers to bear the cost for our decision, some of which are outlined in the item, our rhetoric should at least be consistent with our other approach in other proceedings. Making providers to come up with efficiencies to absorb the cost of 988 deployment while lecturing Congress about unfunded mandates being imposed elsewhere seems a little unfair. In the end, this item has the proverbial and potential to be the blessing for so many and is rightly pursued by members of Congress. I hope nationwide 988 deployment will be a smooth process and that our actions today will make a difference for those Americans at risk of harming themselves. I will support the item, and I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. Earlier this week, I spent time in Baltimore with Edgar Wiggins and his team at Baltimore Crisis Response. They run a community-based center for mental and behavioral health. Edgar has a passion for helping other people, and he's worked in the field of mental health for over 50 years. He gave me a tour of his center, which is housed in an old nursing home that he bought and rebuilt to provide mental health care in the community. The building includes a call center where counselors and trained specialists answer calls to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. I had the chance to meet some of the counselors working in that call center, including Elijah. He grew up on Maryland's Eastern Shore, and from an early age, he said he wanted to give back to his community. He has a talent for relating to people. He's invested the time to receive specialized training in the field of mental health. He described the skills that he says all counselors at the center demonstrate: compassionate listening, providing perspective, staying present, and talking with people who are going through the darkest times in their lives. It's not an easy job. And for the hour that I talked with the counselors there was rarely more than a minute or two between calls to the Lifeline. But Elijah said that the best part of his work is hearing back from people, sometimes weeks later, after he stayed on the phone and helped them through a difficult time. He has quite literally made a difference and changed the trajectory of countless lives. People like Elijah and Edgar offer hope to those in despair, 24 hours a day. And we know that millions of people are in need. Every day, thousands of Americans attempt suicide and far too many lives are lost. In 2018 alone, 1.4 million adults in the US attempted suicide. Feelings of isolation and crisis can touch us all. And some of our most vulnerable groups are particularly at risk. LGBTQ youths are 4 times as likely to contemplate suicide compared to their peers. And we lose over 20 veterans every single day. That's part of why the Veterans Health Administration partnered with the National Lifeline to create the Veterans Crisis Line. It uses the same 1-800 number and allows callers to reach counselors located at one of 3 specialized call centers. I had the chance this week to meet some of those counselors as well, Sydney, Dan, and Anthony, on a video call. Each has a service background, and each has seen firsthand the need for mental health resources for our veterans. They can spend hours on the phone with someone, and they can draw on their own military service to connect with a veteran. One of the counselors, Anthony, talked about the joy he feels when a veteran calls back to let him know that they've, as he put it, come out of the woods thanks to his help. Trained professionals like these are making a difference in the lives of so many Americans, and we must ensure that those in need can easily access these potentially life-saving resources. The record's clear that our action today could help increase awareness and facilitate access to these critical services. As the Baltimore Crisis Center team told me, 988 would be far easier for someone in the depths of a crisis to remember than the current 10-digit lifeline. So I want to applaud Chairman Pai for keeping the agency focused on its critical role in these efforts. The aggressive but attainable timetable for deploying 988 that we adopt today will ensure that these resources are more widely accessible as soon as possible. Until then, until the transition is complete, everyone should continue to remember the 1-800 number, 273-8255. So thank you to the staff of the Wireline Bureau for their work on this very important item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thank you. Every day in this country, thousands and thousands of people call the National Suicide and Mental Health Hotline with a plea for help. They are in crisis. We are in crisis too. That's because all the available data demonstrate that suicide is on the rise. And what strikes me most in these numbers as a parent is that suicide is increasing among young people. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, suicide is now among the top causes of death for teenagers and young adults. Suicide rates for teenage girls are at a 40-year high. In fact, the rate of suicide for girls between 10 and 14 has tripled since the start of the millennium. For Black teens, we've seen similar increases, and for LGBTQ youth, the numbers are downright chilling. More than 1.8 million are expected to contemplate suicide this year alone. These young people deserve a future. They deserve support, and that support should be simple to access. And today, we help make that possible. Following the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act, the FCC formally designates an easy-to-remember 3-digit number for a new National Suicide Hotline. We set a deadline for transition to this number, and we provide technical details about how these calls will be routed and what changes will be required to our telephone networks to actually make this happen. Now, I wholeheartedly approve this effort, but in light of the skyrocketing rates of suicide among our nation's young people, I think the agency should have been more ambitious. Right now, the FCC lacks a plan to incorporate the ability to text into the number we established today. But as we confront the rise in suicide by teenagers across the country, we should acknowledge that texting is their primary form of communication. Voice service has its benefits, but it is not native for most young people. So I regret today's decision is anchored in older technologies and takes a pass on developing texting capabilities with this 3-digit hotline. We should have done so here, and I sincerely hope we can do so in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Suicide is an urgent national problem that touches so many American households. One person in the United States dies by suicide every 11 minutes, yet only half of all Americans experiencing an episode of major depression receive treatment. I support today's decision to designate 988 nationwide as a 3-digit number to access the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline because it will aid millions of Americans in moments of crisis and quickly connect them to the critical support that they need. Calling the Lifeline may be the most important call of a person's life, and nationwide implementation of 988 ensures that anyone in the United States can easily and quickly connect to that life-saving help. I thank the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau for their work on this critical issue. This vote comes at a critical time when the social, health, and economic impacts of COVID-19 pandemic are likely intensifying the mental health concerns in the United States. Many Americans are overwhelmed on so many levels. This unprecedented public health crisis has taken the lives of more than 138,000 people and compounded the mental health issues that so many Americans manage every day. Shelter-in-place orders have limited the access to mental health resources. And while the stress and fear of the pandemic has also placed enormous pressure on each and every American, I recognize that we are asking the telecommunications industry to move quickly. And our decision recognizes the implementation challenges in particular regions that some companies have identified. I nonetheless support establishing a uniform deadline that will support a nationwide rollout of 988. We are facing a growing mental health emergency in the United States. In 2018, 10.7 million adults in the United States thought about suicide. 3.3 million made a plan, and 1.4 million attempted it. Suicide also disproportionately affects at-risk populations. More than 20 veterans die, as we've heard a number of us mention here today. Suicide is the second most common cause of death amongst teenagers and young adults. More than 1.8 million LGBTQ plus and same gender loving youth and young adults seriously consider suicide. Additionally, suicide rates are higher among Native Americans, and rural American populations. These statistics illustrate the severity of the mental health crisis. And we know that there are a myriad of mental health issues among our most vulnerable communities that they're grappling with. We have seen recent data that showed a spike in anxiety and depression among Black Americans in the week that followed the widely circulated video of George Floyd's death. This unprecedented time of uncertainty is why I am particularly concerned about the grave statistics surrounding Black youth. Dr. Michael A. Lindsay and his colleagues found that between 1991 and 2017, suicide attempts among Black adolescents increased by 73%, while attempts among white youth decreased. Both as a commissioner and as a Black parent, I deeply believe in the role that the Federal Communications Commission has to play in this conversation. That's why earlier this week, I hosted an event on Black mental health, where we heard from academics, advocates, media leaders who have a deeply vested interest in elevating complete narratives and solving this complex crisis with innovative and culturally competent approaches. I was proud to have Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, a fearless advocate for our community and the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Emergency Task Force on Black Youth Suicide and Mental Health, speak at my event. And as I previously mentioned, mental health has become increasingly important for communities of color. There are too many highlights from the event to discuss here, but I note that one of the panelists, Nupur Agarwal, Vice President of Social Impact at Viacom CBS's Entertainment and Youth Group, discussed at length the need for the media to support the intersection of mental health and entertainment within Black communities. Additionally, we heard from Dr. Kia Darling-Hammond, who has done transformative work on the concept of thriving, and the name hints of my panel, Thriving While Black, the role of media and communications technology in addressing Black mental health. It was instructive to hear from her and from all the panelists who reified the message that we must reimagine and advocate for a world where Black people and other marginalized groups not only survive, but thrive. Thank you so much for the hard work by the team. The last thing I would mention is that so much of these issues are wrapped up in closing the digital divide as well, and making sure that telehealth is available for all Americans. Closing the digital divide is a critical step towards universal access for mental health care in the United States. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. Earlier this year, I traveled to Toledo, Ohio, to visit a mental health crisis center. Among others, I met with counselors who speak with those who are struggling with thoughts of suicide. Their dedication to helping those in need was inspiring, and to me, it reinforced the need for the FCC to do everything possible to support their important work and to do our part to address America's suicide crisis. Unfortunately, as we have heard, suicide affects an ever-increasing number of Americans' lives. Our nation's suicide rate is at its highest point since World War II. In 2018 alone, as we heard from the presentation, suicide claimed the lives of more than 48,000 Americans, or about one death every 10 minutes. Many more think about or attempt suicide. In 2018, almost 11 million adults in the United States seriously thought about suicide, and over 3 million made a plan for it. And suicide disproportionately impacts at-risk populations. More than 20 veterans die by suicide every day. LGBTQ youth, young adults contemplate suicide at a rate almost 4 times higher than heterosexual young adults. And a recent report found that suicide attempts among African-American teens skyrocketed 73% between 1991 and 2017. And suicide rates are higher in rural America and among Native Americans. But this unfortunate fate is preventable. Suicidal thoughts don't inevitably lead to action. Help is available, and it can be effective. For example, the Lines for Life Crisis Center in Portland, Oregon, reports that its counselors can de-escalate 95% of suicide-related phone calls without the intervention of emergency services. I heard a similar story during my visit to Toledo. A timely match of someone struggling with someone who can help can make all the difference. And that is why what the FCC is doing today is so important. we are designating 988 as the 3-digit dialing code for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline run by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, in partnership with the Department of Veterans Affairs. Establishing the easy-to-remember 988 as the 911 for suicide prevention and mental health services will make it easier for Americans in crisis to access the help that they need. Indeed, experts predict that it will result in millions more Americans receiving the intervention services they desperately need. And when more Americans receive those services, we know that more lives will be saved. Additionally, this achievement and all the efforts to publicize 988 in the time to come will reduce the stigma in our society surrounding suicide and mental illness. I can't put it any better than Lenny Mendonça did. Lenny is a former senior partner at the McKinsey consulting firm, the chief economic and business advisor to the governor of California, Harvard graduate. He's accomplished pretty much everything you can in professional life. But 3 months ago, he abruptly resigned from his position with the state of California. Earlier this week, he explained why in a powerful op-ed in Cal Matters. He faced severe depression and anxiety. And he also explained why he was speaking out with words that I think are highly relevant here. And I quote, "Far too often, people suffer these illnesses with shame and without support. Well-meaning friends discouraged me from sharing my diagnosis of anxiety and depression. They said in so many words that it would end my career. While I respect their counsel, I categorically reject it. I talked about my mountain biking injuries and the metal plate in my leg as a badge of honor. Why should I hide a similar injury to the most important and yet vulnerable and least understood organ in my body, my brain? What does it say about me that I have a mental health issue? It says that I'm human. Hiding my diagnosis breeds shame." I couldn't agree more with Lenny. And my hope is that by establishing a government-backed 988 suicide and mental health 3-digit dialing code, on par with the 911 dialing code that all Americans know for emergencies, we will send a powerful signal that there's nothing shameful about seeking help in times of crisis, that it's a sign of strength, not one of weakness. We will let people know that they are not alone. Turning to some specifics, this order requires voice service providers to transmit 988 calls to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline by July 16th of 2022, the earliest technically feasible date for nationwide implementation of 988. Some phone companies urge us to roll out 988 on a phased-in basis, but we believe that a uniform implementation date will minimize potentially deadly consumer confusion that could result from having 988 available in some, but not all areas. We reject calls for a longer implementation period. The record reflects that we can get this done in 2 years, and the importance of the issue suggests that we must get this done by then. It is literally a life and death issue. I want to thank our partners at the Departments of Health and Human Services and Veterans Affairs for their valuable assistance and coordination on this issue. They will now have the lead role when it comes to educating the public regarding 988 and preparing the Lifeline to handle the expected increase in calls to this vital resource for Americans in crisis. And I'm confident that they will get the job done. Thank you as well to the members of Congress who passed the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act that kickstarted this process, and in particular, Senators Cory Gardner and Tammy Baldwin, former Senator Orrin Hatch, and Congressman Chris Stewart and Seth Moulton. And I want to take a moment and recognize the commission staff for their dedicated and passionate work on this item. Pam Arlick, Justin Falb, Jesse Goodwin, who presented today, Heather Hendrickson, Alex Hobbs, Lisa Hone, Daniel Kahn, Melissa Kirkle, Celia Lewis, Chris Monteith, Zach Ross, and Michelle Slater of the Wireline Competition Bureau, Allison Baker, Tavi Carrare, Paula Sech, Stacey Jordan, Alec McDonald, Julia McHenry, Eric Ralph, and Emily Talaga of the Office of Economics and Analytics, Manisha Ghosh of the Office of Engineering and Technology, Diane Burstein, Elliot Greenwald, Robert McConnell, Michael Scott, and Susie Rosen Singleton of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, Mike Carlson, Terry Kavanaugh, Doug Klein, Elizabeth Lyle, Rick Mallon, Linda Oliver, and David Senzel of the Office of General Counsel, Brenda Boykin, Ken Carlberg, John Evanoff, David Firth, and Michael Wilhelm of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Aaron Boone, Ben Freeman, and Jennifer Salhouse of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, And last but certainly not least, Nurali Patel in the office of the chairman. We will now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr. Commissioner
Unmuting, approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, if you could please announce the next item on today's agenda.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau and is entitled Establishing Additional Call Blocking Rules to Protect Consumers. Patrick Weber, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And before I turn it over to Mr. Weber, just a quick administrative note. If you're not speaking, please mute yourself to avoid feedback and the like. Mr. Weber, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. It's good to see everyone. Today, I'm pleased to introduce an item that addresses the Commission's top consumer protection priority, combating illegal and unwanted robocalls. The item before you builds on the Commission's prior work on call blocking and implements relevant portions of the TRACE Act. Before turning the presentation over to CGB staff, I'd like to thank the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, and the Office of Communications Business Opportunities for their valuable assistance. Jerusha Burnett, Attorney Advisor in CGB's Consumer Policy Division, will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The third report and order on reconsideration, and fourth further notice of proposed rulemaking before you continues the Commission's work targeting illegal and unwanted robocalls. Billions of these types of calls are placed every year. They are not only a nuisance to consumers, they pose real threats because they can facilitate illegal activity such as fraud and identity theft. Today's item advances the use of tools for blocking illegal and unwanted calls before they reach consumers' phones. The report and order establishes two safe harbors from liability under the Communications Act and the Commission's rules for certain blocking by voice service providers. First, pursuant to a directive in the TRACE Act, the report and order establishes a safe harbor for the unintended or inadvertent blocking of wanted calls, where terminating voice service providers block based on reasonable analytics that include caller ID authentication information, and where consumers may opt out of such blocking. Second, it establishes a safe harbor for voice service providers that block calls from bad actor upstream voice service providers that fail to effectively mitigate illegal traffic after being notified of such traffic by the Commission. The report and order also establishes protections for wanted calls. It requires blocking providers to furnish a single point of contact to resolve callers' claims of an inadvertent blocking. It also emphasizes that blocking providers should make all reasonable efforts to ensure that critical calls, such as those from public safety answering points, are not blocked, and that they never block calls to 911. The further notice of proposed rulemaking seeks comment on additional steps to protect consumers. First, it seeks comment on further implementation of the TRACE Act, including how to protect consumers from calls or text messages from unauthenticated numbers, and the need to give consumers and legitimate callers redress for inadvertent blocking at no charge. The NPRM next asks whether the Commission should require voice service providers to respond to certain traceback requests, mitigate bad traffic, and take effective steps to prevent new and renewing customers from originating illegal calls. It also proposes to extend the reasonable analytics-based safe harbor to network-based blocking designed to identify calls that are highly likely to be illegal, asks about redress options for erroneously blocked or labeled calls, and disclosure of block call numbers to consumers upon request and at no charge. The Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I will now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair. Thanks to Congress's bipartisan efforts to enact the TRACE Act, today we take next steps in codifying a safe harbor to shield voice service providers from liability for unintended or inadvertent blocking of calls. Its action is imperative from both a statutory and policy perspective. While providers aren't under an explicit legal requirement to block illegal and so-called unwanted robocalls, make no mistake, they certainly faced astronomical pressure from Congress, the FCC, and advocates to do so. To the extent providers have been instructed to go forth and block, they shouldn't have to bear the corresponding liability risk without reasonable protections. I have therefore led the charge for the establishment of a broad and robust safe harbor for providers engaged in call blocking. In fact, if it were up to me, today's item would have given even more teeth to the first safe harbor, for example, by extending the protection to network-based blocking. After all, if we are simultaneously adopting a second safe harbor for blocking bad actor providers that is not based on consumer consent, I don't see why we wouldn't do the same for the first safe harbor, especially when the provider-based blocking safe harbor, although arguably meritorious, wasn't in the statute or thoroughly debated in the record. While my request to broaden the safe harbor in the report and order portion didn't carry this day, I thank the chair for adding questions to the further notice, seeking comment on doing so at a later point. This issue will clearly need to be revisited and addressed. At the same time, a broad and robust safe harbor for providers must go hand in hand with an equally strong redress mechanism for legitimate calling parties making legal calls that are erroneously blocked. And just don't take it from me, it's in the law. While the initially circulated draft made a little progress by requiring providers to designate a single point of contact for callers to report blocking errors and to investigate and resolve errors in a reasonable amount of time, among other steps, these measures simply didn't cut it with respect to our clear statutory directive to provide callers and consumers with transparency and effective redress options. Therefore, I worked with the parties to come up with a must-have punch list for an effective redress mechanism, and I'm grateful to the chair for agreeing to implement some of that list, including requirements that providers offer complaint resolution free of charge to callers, and that obtaining the protections of the safe harbor be contingent on implementation of the redress mechanism. On other absolute must-haves were added to the further notice to be subject to further comment and implementing action, including requirements that service providers notify callers in real time that their calls are being blocked and resolve blocking disputes within a strict time limit. Those pieces, particularly the requirement that callers receive notification of their blocked calls, also happen to be the ones that legitimate calling parties rightfully argue are the most critical in establishing effective redress. And for good reason. Callers clearly cannot effectively seek redress for erroneous blocked calls if they lack the knowledge that their calls are being blocked or by whom. Nonetheless, real-time notification is a sticking point with voice providers who claim this requirement would be challenging to implement. Thus, while I certainly would have preferred a more beefed-up redress mechanism in the report and order, some of the calling parties' requests will need to be sorted out in the record before we take further action. I thank the chair for working with me to find an appropriate landing spot on these issues in the item. While much work remains in implementing the TRACE Act, I appreciate the progress we make today and look forward to augmenting and improving both the call blocking safe harbor and the corresponding redress mechanism in the future. I will approve the item, and I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. I switched devices. Hopefully you can still hear me.
We can, yes.
Unfortunately. Okay, good. Thanks. The FCC has been working aggressively to end the scourge of illegal robocalls over the past 3 years. We elevated robocalls to our top enforcement priority. We adopted rules allowing carriers to block fraudulent calls, and we required carriers to adopt call authentication programs by a date certain. Earlier this year, we launched a traceback consortium so carriers can work together to find the parties responsible for these massive robocall campaigns and shut them down at the source. And we expanded our efforts just this week by standing up a hospital robocall protection group. I look forward to serving with and working on that group to protect healthcare facilities from robocalls that can interfere with their life-saving work. Today, we take another strong action by allowing carriers to block calls from other carriers that are known to be bad actors, while making sure that legal calls have a process for continuing to get through. These additional protections and actions have the potential to shut down enormous robocall operations at the network level and therefore help protect consumers. So I want to thank the chairman for his efforts on this front and the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau for their hard work on the item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
This is the third order in as many years from the FCC regarding the blocking of robocalls. It is our fourth rulemaking on the same subject, and it comes on the heels of another rulemaking to crack down on one-ring scams, a decision requiring call authentication technology, and rules to establish a traceback consortium. That's a lot of activity on robocalls from this agency. But the volume of robocalls is even higher. Month after month, they number in the billions. Clear that the robocalls are winning. They continue to tumble in ring after ring, offering us something we did not ask for, do not want, and do not need. So here we are. In this third order and fourth rulemaking, the FCC itemizes the conditions under which our phone companies can block robocalls. We establish safe harbors from liability for carriers that use a combination of analytics and call authentication technology to block calls from those responsible for allowing this junk on the line. We also see comment on strengthening participation in traceback efforts. This is good. It's even better that at the behest of the Traced Act, we make clear that this robocall blocking by carriers has to be free to consumers. It wasn't that long ago that I had a dissent because this agency refused to prohibit us from being charged for these robocall blocking technologies. I continue to believe that consumers aren't responsible for putting this junk on the line, so they shouldn't have to pay to get rid of it. Again, this is a positive development, but you know what would be even better still? Getting rid of annoying robocalls for good. Last week, the Supreme Court issued a decision making clear that the Telephone Consumer Protection Act can still be used to protect consumers from robocalls. So let's use it. Because another high court decision is looming that could loosen this law and make auto-dialed robocalls even more common. So let's get to it. Because in the race against robocalls, we have work to do.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now is not the time for us to relax on our efforts to combat illegal robocall tracking and our enforcement efforts. This item represents another step taken to implement requirements in the Traced Act that will enhance our ability to identify the sources of unwanted and illegal robocalls, stop these annoying and sometimes costly calls from reaching consumers. Call blocking is a powerful tool that can effectively stop bad actors in their tracks, but if misapplied, can also harm consumers from calls. And so the details of how we implement the safe harbor mandate to protect voice service providers that choose to block calls matters. The rules we adopt today include two safe harbors. The first allows call blocking where a call is reasonably thought to be unwanted or unlawful. And at this time, only the Stir, Shake, and Caller ID authentication framework satisfies this requirement. Unfortunately, that means providers without all IP networks that cannot implement the Stir, Shake, and protocol will not yet have this safe harbor protection. For this reason, I repeat that it is past time for industry to expedite its development of alternative call authentication methodologies, such as out-of-band Stir, that can be used with non-IP networks to trace and authenticate calls consistent with the Traced Act requirements. In the meantime, all providers, regardless of whether this safe harbor is available to them, should continue to take those reasonable measures to protect consumers from unwanted and illegal robocalls. The second safe harbor empowers the blocking of calls from upstream providers that ignore or fail to effectively mitigate after notification the traffic identified by the Commission as bad. By giving these upstream providers notice and opportunity to explain or address such traffic before blocking occurs, our rules balance the risk of blocking some misidentified good traffic with the need to quickly and effectively identify and cut off the lifeline of suspected bad actors. I believe that the steps taken today are appropriate, and I support our decision here. I likewise fully support measures we adopt to protect against erroneous blocking of emergency-related calls from public safety answering points. and to other outgoing government emergency callers. To clarify that calls involving 911 operators should never be blocked unless they are known without a doubt to be unlawful, and to require call blocking providers to offer a single point of contact for resolving, reporting blocking disputes, as well as investigate and resolve disputes free of charge to callers or other providers within a reasonable time. The order on reconsideration takes a measured and reasonable approach. And finally, I look forward to the development of a record that will allow us to further implement provisions in the TRACE Act, including directives in Section 7 and 10 to initiate a rulemaking to protect subscribers from unwanted calls and texts from an unauthenticated number, and to take final action within 1 year to ensure transparency and effective redress for call blocking services provided on an opt-out or opt-in basis, respectively. My thanks to the staff for their hard work.
Thank you, Commissioner. A quick search on Wikipedia suggests that since 1932, more than 543 zombie films have been made, with many more in the works. And familiar mainstays of zombie movies, of course, are scenes where waves of them eventually overwhelm humans. Humans occasionally have success retaliating, of course, but eventually the zombies overwhelm them. These vignettes from the fantasy world can bring to mind a phenomenon that is all too real and almost as insidious: illegal and unwanted robocalls. Too often, it seems like we are bombarded by waves of unwanted robocalls. While we try to evade them, they eventually catch up to us. It seems at times that there's no escape. And that's why, since 2017, combating illegal robocalls has been the FCC's top consumer protection priority. That's why last December, the President and Congress gave us additional tools to help protect consumers from these unwanted calls. Among other things, the TRACE Act directed us to adopt rules to give voice service providers a safe harbor for the blocking of calls under certain circumstances. And today's order does just that. We implement this portion of the TRACE Act by assuring terminating service providers that good faith blocking of calls will not result in liability under the Communications Act and our rules if they inadvertently block wanted calls. This safe harbor is only available to entities that block calls based on reasonable analytics designed to identify unwanted calls. These reasonable analytics must be based in part on information provided by the STIR/SHAKEN call authentication framework, where such information is available for a particular call. And for non-IP-based calls, this safe harbor is available for blocked calls based on any other effective call authentication framework that satisfies the TRACE Act. We also established a second safe harbor for voice service providers that block all calls from bad actors that continue to allow unwanted calls to traverse their networks. This second safe harbor builds upon joint letters issued earlier this year by the FCC's Enforcement Bureau and the Federal Trade Commission, making clear that, in some instances, provider-based blocking is appropriate. Specifically, let's say an upstream provider has been notified by the Commission it's carrying unlawful traffic. And let's say further that it fails to effectively mitigate such traffic or to implement ineffective measures to prevent customers from using its network to originate illegal calls. In that case, a voice service provider may block calls from that upstream provider. In addition to these safe harbors, we require that call blocking providers make available a single point of contact to resolve inadvertent blocking. We also emphasize that providers should make all reasonable efforts to ensure that they don't block critical calls, such as those from public safety answering points, and that they should never block calls to 911. And in the further notice, we look forward and we ask how we can build on our work in today's order and further implement the TRACE Act. Today's action is just the latest in our ongoing campaign to protect all Americans from unwanted robocalls. From authorizing call blocking by default to mandating the implementation of a call authentication framework to taking strong enforcement actions, such as last month's proposed record $225 million fine against a telemarketer who made approximately 1 billion spoof robocalls. We are pulling out all the stops to combat these calls. And there's evidence that, with the collective efforts of government and industry, we are making progress. For example, the FTC recently reported that the number of robocall complaints it received in April and May were down over 60% compared to those same months last year. And the UMail Robocall Index shows that the number of robocalls in the United States declined by about 1/3 from the first quarter of 2020 to the second. But we aren't going to rest on our laurels. To borrow from Alpha and The Walking Dead, we're going to remain vigilant with eyes open, because when it comes to unwanted robocalls, as with zombies, where there's one, there's more. My thanks to the hardworking staff who crafted this item. Your tireless commitment to protecting the American consumer from unwanted robocalls is inspiring. And so, particular thanks to the staff from the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Office of General Counsel, the Enforcement Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and the Office of Communications Business Opportunities. With that, we will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
And the chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The third item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau and is entitled Protecting Against National Security Threats to the Communications Supply Chain through FCC Programs. Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Monteith, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all of you again. The Wireline Competition Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration a declaratory ruling and second further notice of proposed rulemaking as part of the Commission's ongoing efforts to secure our nation's communications supply chain. I would like to thank the Bureau team for their hard work on this item, as well as our colleagues in the Office of General Counsel, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. Brian Cruikshank, Attorney Advisor in the Wireline Competition Bureau's Telecommunications Access Policy Division, will now present the item. Brian?
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The Commission, Congress, and the Executive Branch have long stressed the importance of securing the nation's communication supply chain. In its November 2019 supply chain order, the Commission prohibited the use of the Universal Service Fund to purchase, obtain, maintain, improve, modify, or otherwise support any equipment or services produced or provided by any company posing a national security threat to the integrity of communications networks or the communications supply chain. In March 2020, the President signed the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act of 2019, or Secure Networks Act, into law. With today's item, the Commission would take further steps to protect the nation's communications networks from potential security threats by integrating provisions of the Secure Networks Act into its existing supply chain rulemaking. The declaratory ruling, if adopted, would find that the Commission's November 2019 prohibition on the use of USF support for equipment and services produced or provided by a company that poses a national security threat substantially implements the Commission's obligations under Section 3A of the Secure Networks Act, which requires the Commission to prohibit the use of federal subsidies for covered communications equipment and services. The accompanying second further notice of proposed rulemaking, if adopted, would see comment on how to implement the statutory requirements contained in Sections 2, 3, 5, and 7 of the Secure Networks Act. Section 2 of the statute directs the Commission to publish a list of covered communications equipment and services. The notice would propose processes to place covered communications equipment and services on the list and to incorporate determinations that certain equipment or services pose an unacceptable risk to national security. As for Section 3, the notice would propose to adopt a new rule that would prohibit the use of federal subsidies administered by the Commission, including USF funding, to purchase, rent, lease, otherwise obtain, or maintain covered communications equipment and services that are placed on that list required by Section 2. Section 5 of the Secure Networks Act requires providers of advanced communication services to report annually whether they have purchased, rented, leased, or otherwise obtained any covered communications equipment and services. The notice would seek comment on the form and type of information filers should be required to submit. Section 7 of the Secure Networks Act directs the Commission to implement enforcement penalties and recovery of improperly spent funds. The notice would seek comment on proposals to implement these enforcement provisions. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cruikshank. And before I turn it over to Commissioner O'Reilly, let me note that not only are you the most dapper person to have spoken on this open meeting thus far, but this is, as I understand it, your first presentation at an open meeting. Job well done, and thank you so much for your work on the item.
Thank you.
We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maintaining the security and integrity of our communications infrastructure is of paramount importance. Over the past year or so, it rightfully has been a heightened priority of the FCC, administration, and Congress to protect our communications network from external threats, such as incursions by the Chinese Communist government through the companies they control. For instance, the Commission prohibited certain equipment from being supported by USF funds, designated Huawei and ZTE as potential threats to our infrastructure, and sought comment on ripping and replacing certain equipment from all our networks, among other actions. The President has signed an executive order providing the Department of Commerce with the authority to prohibit transactions when they would pose a threat to U.S. infrastructure or national security. Congress has passed multiple bills addressing Huawei and ZTE and created the Federal Acquisition Security Council to lead the government-wide effort to evaluate threats posed by communication services and equipment. Most recently, the Secure 5G and Beyond Act, authored and shepherded through Congress by Senator Cornyn, was signed into law to keep 5G networks secure from foreign interference. I appreciate all of these efforts that have brought added attention to and provided much needed guidance on these important matters. Most relevant for today's item is the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act, which incorporates and expands upon the 2019 actions taken by the Commission. This item declares that the FCC's actions to prohibit USF funds from being spent on Huawei and ZTE equipment is consistent with and satisfies certain provisions of the Act, and it seeks comment on how to implement the remainder of the law. As always, I will follow congressional direction and fully support our action today. Many thanks to Representatives Pallone, Walden, Matsui, Guthrie for ushering this bill through Congress. I do have one area of concern, however, and that is related to today's item. With all of the activity previously described, there are multiple conversations taking place about what equipment and services pose an actual risk to our national security. This is an important but not easy undertaking and involves some necessary line drawing. The FCC used a very broad definition in 2019, and based on our definition, certain entities reported to the FCC whether they had covered equipment in their networks. Other federal agencies, however, do not appear to be taking the exact same approach. Given the lack of consensus on what equipment and services pose a national security risk, we should take a step back and delay any publication of the list of companies that reported covered equipment under our definition. Publicly exposing companies which did not do anything wrong at the time they purchased their equipment and potentially causing substantial financial harm should only be considered as a necessary step if their equipment is ultimately determined to pose a true threat. This is not to say that the Commission erred in requesting this data, as sometimes there is a first mover disadvantage, or that this information does not provide the Commission with useful insights. But in order to provide certainty to industry and clarity to Americans about the actual risks of using certain networks, all involved federal agencies should be on the same page regarding what equipment and services could harm our national security before prematurely publishing a list of names, which in the end may include companies whose equipment ultimately is determined not to cause concern. I thank the chair for bringing this important item to a vote, and I will approve.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. The rule of law, clean and light-handed government, the values of a free society, the beginnings of representative government and democratic accountability. Hong Kong's values are decent values. They're universal values. They're the values of the future in Asia as elsewhere, a future in which the happiest and richest communities and the most confident and most stable too will be those that best combine political liberty and economic freedom as we do here today. Now, Hong Kong people are to run Hong Kong. That is the promise, and that is the unshakable destiny. Those were the words of Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, on June 30th, 1997, at the handover ceremony for British rule to the People's Republic of China. For the next 20 years, that destiny did not shake. Hong Kong prospered as a free, self-governing community, its judiciary independent, its markets open. And like Taiwan, it served as a potent reminder to mainland China of what could be. One country, two systems was guaranteed by law. Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping negotiated in writing 50 years of freedom for Hong Kong. It was the reformers' bet that the example of Hong Kong would inspire mainland China to agitate for changes to their own government. And so Article 5 of Hong Kong's new constitution provided that, quote, the previous capitalist system and way of life shall remain unchanged for 5 decades. But the reformers' hope for Hong Kong was not based on paper alone. By 1997, Hong Kong already had grown into a global financial center to rival New York or London. It was an international air and cargo hub. It was itself a member of the WTO several years preceding China's admission. China's regime looked longingly at Hong Kong's success and had created the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone bordering Hong Kong to spur manufacturing and leverage the city's advantages. In short, the theory was Hong Kong would be too rich to fail. China had too much invested in Hong Kong's economic success, spilling into the rest of China to risk a political clampdown. Yet Beijing now has taken that risk. 2 weeks ago, it imposed on Hong Kong a new security law, making it a crime to abet criticism of Beijing, stripping residents of their broad right to trial by jury, and easing extradition to the mainland, where durable rights against the government are rare. According to Hong Kong police, the very first arrest made under the new security law was for a man who had the audacity to unfurl a Hong Kong independence flag in public. The US government has been examining Huawei, ZTE, and other telecom suppliers with close ties to communist China. We've cataloged a pattern of misdirected traffic, software vulnerabilities, and suspicious deployments. We have examined China's national intelligence law, which compels companies aid in advancing, quote, a comprehensive concept of national security. And we've observed the due process China's judiciary offers and the conviction rate it delivers for the regime. Huawei's and others' response, again and again, comes back to this. Why would we, successful international suppliers of telecom, risk our reputations and our profits by making our products insecure? And why would the Chinese regime risk its years of investment in these companies for a leg up on spying? They were meant to be rhetorical questions. They can't be after Hong Kong. If one country, two systems has revealed itself as a sham in Hong Kong, we cannot expect one company, two systems to fare any better at Huawei. It's therefore right that Congress acted to protect our security against these threats. And through this order, again, so do we. I want to thank the Wireline Competition Bureau and all of the Commission's staff for their hard work on this item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
We live in a world gone wireless. Our future will be built on 5G infrastructure. So we need to ensure that infrastructure is safe, and that begins with keeping insecure equipment out of our networks. And today the FCC helps do just that by acting at the direction of Congress to implement the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act. This law, of course, prohibits the use of public funds to obtain communications equipment or services from a company that poses a national security risk. In addition, it requires the FCC to maintain a list of covered communications equipment or services that could undermine our national security, and it authorizes a program to reimburse the cost of replacing prohibited equipment. But take note, because this is only one action in a series by this agency to keep insecure equipment out of our nation's communications networks. 2 years ago, the FCC first sought comment on supply chain issues and proposed a rule to prohibit the use of universal service funds to purchase equipment and services from providers that may pose a security risk. Last year, we adopted this rule. Then we started an information collection to survey where insecure equipment is in our networks and estimate the cost to remove it. We also denied an application from China Mobile to enter our markets and put 4 other similarly situated companies on notice that they too could share the same fate. Then last month, we designated 2 Chinese companies, Huawei and ZTE, as national security threats because the evidence suggests the Chinese government could exert control over them. And it's clear the world is watching because just this week, the United Kingdom announced it too will bar its networks from using 5G equipment made by untrusted providers. In the instant decision, we find that our efforts last year prohibiting the use of universal service funds to support the purchase of insecure equipment and services largely satisfies our new obligations under Section 3 of the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act. Then in the rulemaking, we seek comment on how to implement the remaining aspects of this law. And over time, I hope we can do more to harmonize the processes we established last year with those required under this new law. I also hope we can explore how existing law, from the Communications Act to the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, can bolster these efforts. So today's decision and rulemaking has my support. But let's not stop there, because there's so much more we can do to secure our 5G future. There is more we can do to power the future of innovation. There is more we can do to make sure the United States has a fighting chance at leading in what comes next. And that begins with fixing our most obvious missteps. Those include suspending new work visas for a wide variety of technology jobs and deterring foreign students from studying and staying on our shores. Something the president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology has said fuels our persistent advantage in scientific creativity. Likewise, we need to be mindful how increased consolidation in our economy impacts what innovations make it to market and get the opportunity to change our world. Closer to home, we need the FCC to do more than just ban the presence of Chinese companies, because this is not about retribution. It is about building a better future. If we want to ensure no equipment provider can undermine our communications, we need the United States to spur a new and more innovative and diverse ecosystem of secure equipment and equipment providers. And I believe the FCC can help do just that. A year ago, at a gathering of Mobile World Congress, I was the first to call on the FCC to develop a more secure communications future by supporting open radio access networks, or Open RAN. The RAN, of course, is the part of the network that sits between your device and the network core. It is the most expensive and restrictive part of the network today. All major components of a RAN have to come from the same vendor. There is no ability to mix and match. Now, when I offered this idea, no companies based in the United States were manufacturing 5G equipment for this part of our networks, thanks in part to a long history of consolidation in the sector. Meanwhile, Chinese companies were selling nearly half of all global RAN gear. The security risks inherent in this state of affairs are really easy to understand. So I suggested we do something to reverse these trends. I suggested if we can unlock the RAN by virtualizing this part of the network, we could help spur a market for more secure 5G equipment. We could expand the number of suppliers, promote the long-term viability of the 5G supply chain, and prevent growing dependence on Chinese vendors. Even better, this effort could push the market for 5G equipment to the sectors where the United States is strongest, in software and semiconductors. Now, I got the chance to talk about this more when I testified before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs. And in recent months, I'm pleased that it's also garnered support from my colleagues at the FCC. It's also a recurring theme in comments to the NTIA on the National Strategy to Secure 5G Implementation Plan. And it's been embraced by more than 30 companies that have joined the Open RAN Policy Coalition. So this is progress. But here's what we need to do next. First, we need a whole of government approach to advancing Open RAN in the United States. Right now, we don't have it. The Attorney General recently called this effort just pie in the sky. He's not right. It may be audacious, but that's exactly why the United States needs to lead. Yet there are reports that the Department of State now wants a watered-down version of the Open RAN concept. This is traveling. Across the board, we need a more cohesive government-wide 5G strategy, especially with Open RAN. Second, we need to develop test beds in the United States that bring together a mix of stakeholders interested in developing and promoting Open RAN. As I pointed out before, the FCC can build this into our ongoing effort to authorize citywide 5G test beds in New York and Salt Lake City. But we still haven't done so. And in the meantime, the United Kingdom is working on 5G test beds to support Open RAN. The European Union is boosting investment in 5G equipment innovation. And a Japanese company has already deployed a commercial mobile network using Open RAN. Plus, the Department of Defense is working on 5G test beds that will include these architectures. I think the FCC should support test beds for the commercial development of this capability too. Third, we need to task the FCC's Communication Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council with identifying impediments to Open RAN development in the United States and exploring what new efforts can be undertaken to support secure and interoperable equipment. This group already has a charter to consider security risks in emerging 5G networks. We need to expand it to explore this technology. Similarly, when the FCC participates in standard-setting bodies like 3GPP and the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions, we need to consider how we can support the goals of openness and interoperability. Fourth and finally, we need resources to make all of this happen. For starters, we need an appropriation from Congress for the reimbursement program created by the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act. But solving our security challenges in the present is not going to be enough. So I hope Congress proceeds with the Utilizing Strategic Allied Telecommunications Act, which would fund research and development for a secure wireless supply chain. And you know, the odds are good, because just this week, the Energy and Commerce Committee advanced this legislation to the full House of Representatives. In addition, elements of the Senate version of this bill have been included in the Intelligence Authorization Act, demonstrating just how powerful these matters are for national security, both at home and abroad. Now, all of these efforts would help our supply chain challenges today, and more importantly, assist with the development of a more secure and innovative future. We need to remember we cannot limit our focus to keeping untrusted companies and Chinese equipment out of our networks. We need a vibrant and diverse set of trusted equipment and companies in their place, and the United States should help lead the development of this new communications ecosystem. But the most important thing to do is to get started right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Network security is national security. And as we confront foreign cyber threats to our economy, our elections, and even our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, these words have never been truer. Certain foreign telecommunications equipment companies rapidly vaulted themselves into a leading global position, and they also gained a foothold in our U.S. networks. Today's decision is another step by this commission toward eliminating untrustworthy equipment in our networks. But we need a broader, more cohesive plan to develop and support alternatives that both replace existing equipment and position us to better compete in our future. Through its Made in China 2025 strategy, the Chinese government has provided critical support to Huawei and ZTE that artificially lowered their prices, assisted in their research and product development, and undercut international competition. This was not a free market competition, but a larger strategy to leverage economic power into geopolitical dominance. And through this unfair advantage, the equipment produced by these corporations has become pervasive around the world. And at first glance, these actions could be considered simple economic gamesmanship, a tactical ploy to become the dominant telecom equipment ecosystem set to manufacturer standards and win the race to 5G. But the tide is turning, as we saw earlier this week with the UK banning Huawei from its infrastructure. And we've established in this proceeding a view that overlooks the other half of the bargain between those foreign competitors and their government. According to our intelligence agencies, in exchange for subsidized equipment, corporations like Huawei and ZTE have siphoned data, have allowed backdoor access to state agencies, and have enabled functionality for network disruption. As a result, the technological foundation of communication networks has been weaponized. Last year, I called for the FCC to find each piece of untrustworthy equipment in our networks, to fix the problem by instituting a replacement program, and to fund the replacement of this equipment. My Find It, Fix It, Fund It proposal was a comprehensive and unequivocal response. Untrustworthy equipment that threatens our data, privacy, and network security cannot be managed or tolerated in any form. Today, as we have done before, we largely codify that response and integrate it with provisions of the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act. Universal service funds will no longer be used to finance commerce with bad faith actors, and we begin proceeding to replace the untrustworthy equipment in our networks. As our world becomes even more interconnected, the FCC has a critical role to play in protecting that security. The Commission must be proactive, not reactive, in national security measures in order to avoid problems like the untrustworthy network equipment in our future. And although we've done much remains to be done. A few additional thoughts. First, as I've called for before, we need to create an FCC National Security Task Force. The Commission currently reviews national security issues on a distributed basis amongst the various bureaus. For example, the International Bureau refers applications for Section 214 authorizations involving foreign ownership to Team Telecom for national security review. The Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau participates in the National Security Council's NSPM4 process. And even separately, the Wireline Competition and Wireless Telecommunication Bureaus consider national security in license transfers and number portability matters. This distributed structure makes internal coordination challenging and risks inconsistent treatment of national security issues between different bureaus. These issues are not going to diminish. Quite the opposite. In fact, I expect that the Commission will continue to see an increase in the number and complexity of issues that will touch on national security. Security issues for Team Telecom, CFIUS, 214 authorizations, numbering are going to become even more common. We must be more intentional than ever to ensure that the whole of the FCC is more coordinated, more deliberative, more collaborative. The FCC should issue a public notice creating a national security task force like we've done with other task forces established by the FCC in the past. Second, as we proceed, we must promote equipment supplier diversity and level the competitive playing field so that we have options for replacing this equipment and avoid replicating this situation in the future. We must champion new innovations that can ensure a more robust, reliable communications network. And this includes serious consideration of Open RAN, ORAN technology solutions for replacing untrustworthy equipment and updating our communications infrastructure generally. ORAN is promising because it enables a single distributed system of interoperable hardware. With that interoperability, individual components can be interchanged without replacing the whole system. And this granular approach reduces the barriers to entry for radio access network component vendors, particularly small scale, specialized suppliers, and presents a unique opportunity for American companies to reassert our role in the communications equipment sector. A new competitive and diverse market of vendors would allow each carrier to establish the most innovative and appropriate combination of network components for its needs, rather than purchasing equipment on a one-size-fits-all basis. ORAN emphasizes software-defined functions through open interfaces and cloud hierarchy. Both features accommodate innovative and allow for a more robust and responsive network environment. For example, scaled design improvements, as well as updates to network systems, and may occur at lower cost and faster timetables. This responsiveness will allow carriers to harmoniously merge legacy and next generation wireless systems as they replace older, untrustworthy equipment. And we know that ORAN isn't, as some have suggested, pie in the sky. It's available right now. Dish Network recently selected NetWare software provider Mavenir to deliver cloud-native ORAN software to build out its 5G wireless networks. And to today, the scope of our item focuses on how we rip, but not on how we replace. In reality, the two go together by necessity. We must do some deep and proactive thinking on the best policies to effectuate our goals of promoting secure telecommunications networks that benefit our shared future and get the best value for American taxpayer dollars. So here's a new idea. To that end, and in future items, I recommend that we explore that rip and replace carriers rebuilding its networks be required to consider solutions offered by an ORAN provider. That would achieve many of our goals, including encouraging global competition with Huawei, capitalizing on US software advantages, accelerating the development of ORAN as a product model and as a business case, and allowing for alternative vendors to enter the market and offer specific network solutions. If American taxpayer dollars are going to rebuild these networks, Americans should get the best value and the most benefit. Third, even as we discuss potential alternatives to the untrustworthy equipment in our communications networks, we still lack the funding necessary to remove and replace that equipment. Last year, in meetings across the country, small carriers repeatedly told me about their need for help to replace equipment that they bought legally and in good faith. To their credit, many of these same carriers have experienced substantial losses as a result of honoring the Keep Americans Connected pledge, further weakening their ability to replace this equipment on their own. We must coordinate with Congress to ensure that sufficient funds are appropriated and that a remedy can be provided quickly and responsibly. Our actions today are swift and clear, but much work lies ahead. We must join with policymakers both here and abroad to address not only the challenges of untrustworthy equipment already in our networks, but how to respond to adversary states' attempts to leverage market dominance into geopolitical influence. Experience has taught us that we cannot counter these efforts only by identifying a realistic alternative. Let's get to work, and I thank you and I thank the staff for their hard work on this item. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. National security experts have warned that when companies are beholden to foreign governments with interests adverse to the United States, their products and services can threaten our country. This is certainly the case with the Chinese telecommunications equipment manufacturers Huawei and ZTE. As Lieutenant General and former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster recently explained in The Atlantic, China uses major telecommunications companies to control communications networks and the internet overseas. This is not surprising, or to coin a phrase, you don't say. Huawei and ZTE each have close ties to the Chinese Communist Party and China's military, and both companies are broadly subject to Chinese law, obligating them to cooperate with the country's intelligence services. With respect to Huawei, McMaster writes, there should no longer be any dispute concerning the need to defend against Huawei and its role in China's security apparatus. In light of the incontrovertible evidence of the grave national security danger associated with a wide array of Huawei's telecommunications equipment, he advises that a policy priority for the United States and its allies should be the development of infrastructure, particularly 5G communications, to form trusted networks that protect sensitive and proprietary data. At the FCC, we couldn't agree more. And that's why last fall, the Commission unanimously adopted a ban on the use of universal service support to purchase, obtain, or maintain any equipment or services from companies posing a national security threat to communications networks or the communications supply chain. And last month, the FCC's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau formally designated Huawei and ZTE as covered companies for purposes of our November 2019 ban. As a result, the FCC's $8.3 billion annual Universal Service Fund can no longer be used to underwrite these suppliers. Well, today we take additional steps to protect America's communications networks from national security threats. Specifically, we integrate provisions of the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act of 2019, which was enacted in March of 2020, into our existing supply chain rulemaking proceeding. These steps have been described in detail. I'll simply say that the path they lead to is to a more secure communications infrastructure in the United States. For their outstanding work in helping to secure that priority, I'd like to thank the Commission staff, particularly Pam Arluck, Brian Cruikshank, Justin Falb, Trent Harkrader, Billy Layton, Chris Monteith, Ramesh Nagarajan, Ryan Palmer, and Morgan Reeds of the Wireline Competition Bureau, Melina Barzilai, Doug Klein, Rick Mallon, and Bill Richardson from the Office of General Counsel, Tanner Hinkle, Ken Lynch, Alec McDonald, and Steve Rosenberg of the Office of Economics and Analytics, Jeff Goldthorpe, Deb Jordan, Nikki McGinnis, Suswath Misra, and Alston Randezzo of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Chrysanthu, Martin Duxcat, Michael Hobb, Ira Keltz, Aspa Perutzas, and Sean Yun of the Office of Engineering and Technology, and Maura McGowan of the Office of Communications Business Opportunities. I'd also like to thank the bipartisan group of senators and representatives who led efforts to pass the Secure Networks Act, including Chairman Wicker, Senator Warner, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and others on the various committees of jurisdiction. Thank you as well to Senators Cotton and Rubio for highlighting this issue. And thanks as well to our federal partners of the White House National Security Council, the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and elsewhere for their collaboration on this issue, particularly as we have worked abroad with foreign nations, including the United Kingdom, which I visited last year and which made a very significant decision, of course, earlier this week. All of these efforts are helping to make our communications network safer, and I look forward to continuing to work with them and my fellow commissioners on this national priority. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. And thanks to everybody for accommodating my fellow resident here who was a little bit exuberant there. Madam Secretary, can you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fourth item today is entitled Improving Vertical Location Accuracy for Wireless 911 Calls. The item will be presented by the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and Lisa Folks, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Chief Folks, if you are there, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say good morning, but it's now good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and commissioners. When you call 911, time is of the essence, and that is why today's action is so important. The sixth report and order on reconsideration you are considering today will help first responders more accurately identify the floor level of most wireless 911 calls. These actions will help keep industry on track with the location accuracy benchmarks and timeframes established in our rules to achieve our goal of reducing emergency response times and saving lives. With me today from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau is Emily Kaditz, an attorney advisor in the Cybersecurity and Communications Reliability Division. This is Ms. Kaditz's first time presenting an item before the commission. I would also like to thank David Firth, Erica Olson, John Evanoff, Brenda Boykin, and Jill Coogan and Christopher Fideli, both of whom are new members of the PSHSB family, and Razul Safavian for their work on this item. All of these folks worked tirelessly to bring this item before you today. They are FCC rock stars and have my utmost appreciation and admiration. I would also like to thank other Bureau staff for their hard work on this item, as well as the other bureaus and offices that contributed. Now to Ms. Kaditz.
Thank you, Chief Folks. Good afternoon, Chairman Pai and Commissioners. As Chief Folks noted, today's sixth report and order on reconsideration would bring the benefits of improved vertical or Z-axis location accuracy to wireless 911 callers nationwide, which can reduce emergency response times and ultimately save lives. In the fifth report and order in this proceeding, the Commission adopted a Z-axis location accuracy metric of plus or minus 3 meters relative to the handset for 80% of 911 calls from wireless phones. Under the timetable previously established in the Commission's rules, nationwide wireless providers must meet April 2021 and April 2023 deadlines for deploying Z-axis technology that complies with this metric in the top 25 and top 50 cellular market areas, respectively. Today's item would affirm these benchmarks and reject an untimely proposal to weaken or delay them. In addition, the item would require nationwide wireless carriers to deploy Z access technology nationwide by April 2025. Non-nationwide wireless providers would have an additional year to deploy Z access technology throughout their service areas. The item would also require wireless carriers to provide a caller's dispatchable location with wireless 911 calls, where it is technically feasible to do so. This is the same requirement that the Commission applied to wireline, interconnected VoIP, and multi-line telephone system providers and last year's implementing Ray-Bombs Act, and would promote consistency in our 911 rules across all technology platforms. The item would also provide wireless carriers additional options to meet the upcoming benchmarks by 1, deploying Z access technology to cover 80% of the buildings that exceed 3 stories in the top 50 cellular market areas, where vertical location information is most vital to first responders, or 2, deploying Z access capable handsets on a nationwide basis. In addition, the item would provide wireless providers a greater flexibility in how they provide dispatchable location information. All of these options would be subject to the consumer privacy protections that the Commission adopted for 911 location information in the 5th report and order. Finally, the order on reconsideration denies a petition for reconsideration of the 5th report and order that seeks to impose unwarranted testing and information sharing requirements on wireless providers. Taken together, these actions place wireless carriers on course for providing public safety call takers and first responders the best available vertical location information for the benefit of 911 callers seeking emergency assistance. The Bureau recommends adoption of the 6th report and order on reconsideration, and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Caves, for this presentation, which is your first. So congratulations on the milestone. May there be many more. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe this is the 6th Z-axis related item that I voted on since joining the Commission. I apologize in advance to those who may experience a bit of deja vu as you hear my words today. In all seriousness, I continue to be fully supportive of our ultimate goal, providing first responders the pinpoint location information they need to find and provide aid to Americans in peril. These professionals are there to assist us in the worst of times, when every second counts and the location data provided to them is crucial, especially in urban centers. From manufacturing and wireless providers to fire departments and localities to all of the associations representing the various interested parties, there is a common goal to develop a solution to provide the best information as quickly as possible. But ultimately, the location provided must be absolutely be correct and reliable if we're going to reach this goal. While equipment and wireless providers are making great strides with Z-axis technologies, the technology is still not commercially deployed or proven. Promising results have been achieved in the testbed environment, but there are no real-world operations yet. While meeting deadlines and benchmarks is still a work in progress nonetheless, today we double down and require Z-axis nationwide availability by 2025, as if the ultimate remedy requires just one more mandate. We now have wireless providers and manufacturers expressing concerns about the direction in which we are headed. We cannot just dismiss their merits of their arguments by attacking their motives or hiding behind Commission procedures. These are the very companies that we're going to rely on to make this technology work, and they seem to have serious doubts. The handset-based solutions that will facilitate nationwide deployment are currently less accurate than the network-based systems this Commission has been considering for years. I am concerned that the phase 2 history is repeating itself, heading us towards a deluge of wireless waivers. And the handset-based technology may not be ready in time to meet the earliest deadlines, forcing providers to switch to Z-axis solutions midstream. That seems neither effective nor cost efficient, and we know who will ultimately pay for this, the American consumer. One way or another, these costs will be passed on in the form of higher bills or reduced functionality. And of course, our cost-benefit analysis never considered such duplication of efforts. In fact, the CBA relies on the same old, tired, and inaccurate analysis we have used for years. Thankfully, today's item does provide more flexibility, such as allowing providers to comply by deploying Z-axis technology on handsets, covering 80% of the cellular market's areas, multi-story buildings, and providing dispatchable location, which is still the ultimate goal without the National Emergency Address Database, or NEAD. Further, I'm pleased that we have withheld from making other premature rule changes. The goal should be to get what is already required actually working and helping people before shifting goalposts any further. I approve with the same reservations that I have had since 2014, and I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Nearly 250 million 911 calls are dialed each year. If you assume an even distribution, that works out to the average American making an emergency call every 16 months. And although we learned as kids when and how and for what purposes to dial 911, those calls are never easy. A fire, a break-in, a sick family member, they can rattle even cool-headed people. In those crisis moments, getting one's bearings and telling the operator where help is needed can be difficult. So I think I can speak for all of us, public safety advocates, the wireless industry, and each of my fellow commissioners when I say that we need tech's help to improve 911 response. Since at least 2015, the Commission has been tightening our mandate that wireless phones transmit to 911 operators certain location information that can be tied to an address or a place on a map. It's taken longer to arrive at a height information requirement, with our first deadline coming next April. But we're getting there with barometers and software that leverage device signals. This is not an achievement of government mandates, but of technologists and entrepreneurs focused on solving the problem. Already 2 companies have demonstrated how using air pressure can accurately project the height of a call's origin. Google is making progress with a different approach, and Apple will demonstrate its solution in the test bed this fall. We are grateful for these companies' efforts and confident that their solutions will save lives. So I want to thank the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau for its continued focus on this important issue. It has my full support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
The first telephone number I taught my children was 911. It is a number that every one of us knows by heart, but every one of us hopes we will never have to use. As the old saying goes, you may only call 911 once in your life, but it will be the most important call you ever make. And when you do make that call, on the other end of the line is a 911 operator. They are the starting point for all emergency response. Because when the unthinkable occurs, it is a 911 professional taking down the details and organizing how first responders will come to your aid. The most important detail, of course, is knowing exactly where you are. There was a time, not that long ago, when location information was easy to know, when 911 calls were just on wired networks, a street address accompanied every call. But today, 4 out of 5 911 calls come from wireless phones. So for years, this agency has been trying to come up with a way to ensure that every wireless call features precise location information so that in crisis, first responders can find you no matter who you are or where you live. So here's what I believe. Our 911 system should be simple to use. It should provide 911 operators with actionable information, and that information should be useful for public safety officials who help keep us safe. And those aren't abstract principles. They're the ideas that have come up over and over again in discussions at the more than 24 911 call centers I have visited, from California to Colorado, Alaska to Alabama, Vermont to Virginia, and so many more places in between. I believe they should inform everything we do with 911. And that brings me to today's effort. In this decision, the FCC makes its 6th attempt to refine what information will be transmitted about the location of a wireless caller dialing 911. In particular, the agency adjusts its rules that it fashioned just 9 months ago regarding the vertical location information that accompanies a wireless 911 call from a multi-story building. So let me begin by recognizing the good in this order. 9 months ago, the FCC adopted policies to improve wireless location information for 911 calls that would only apply in the 50 largest metropolitan areas. I called for us to go further and make those rules apply nationwide. As I said at the time, there are office parks, townhomes, and other multi-story structures in rural areas too. Moreover, there is nothing simple or just about limiting actionable information to our nation's largest cities. So I'm pleased today that we recognize that a uniform national policy is the way to go. I thank my colleagues for seeing the light and changing course. While we get this right, in other ways, I fear today's decision misses the mark. It makes complex what should be simple when we call 911. It makes location information available, but not in any format that is actionable for 911 operators. And it makes it too hard for public safety officials to use the information that is provided. So let me explain. First, we need a 911 system that works simply for all of the time. Today, no matter who you are or where you live, you can call 911. The location information that accompanies your call doesn't distinguish between your device or service plan. This is the way it should be. 911 is uniformly available for everyone. But with today's decision, we choose another course. That's because we adopt an approach that requires 911 opt-in. Every wireless consumer will only get full location information sent with their emergency calls if they perform a very specific software update on their device or respond to a notice from their carrier regarding an application that may be available. Let's be honest. In the best case, a whole lot of people are going to miss this one, never download it, or respond to the fine print in a service notice. Plus, there are low-cost phones on the market that lack the sensor technology necessary to even make this work. As a result, the record suggests we might only get vertical location information with as few as 2% of calls to 911. That should set off alarm bells. Moreover, this is fundamentally at odds with how 911 has previously been provisioned in this country. Our tradition is to make it simple and democratic, possible for everyone to reach 911 everywhere. But now, full location information only accompanies that call if you opt into this new system or you've bought the right phone. That's not an outcome I can accept. Second, we need to provide 911 operators actionable location information. 9 months ago, the FCC adopted a standard for wireless carriers providing vertical location information using a Z-axis solution. Specifically, the agency required that wireless carriers offer public safety on indoor callers' vertical location measured at plus or minus 3 meters, height above ellipsoid. At the time, I observed that this measurement system does not produce actionable data that a 911 operator could ever easily use. That's because when calls come tumbling into 911 in a crisis, this system produces a string of numbers representing raw data measuring vertical location from the center of the Earth's mass. There's no floor number in a building. There's no measurement from street level. There's just a series of numbers that offer remarkably little to a 911 operator who has just seconds to organize public safety response. To make this data truly actionable, it needs to be calibrated, translated, and reworked into something meaningful. As a result, stakeholders have asked the FCC for clarification about how this measurement will even work. Last week, Richard Napolitano, the commanding officer in charge of public safety communications in New York, weighed in. He warned that when a call is placed to 911 and the location is not attainable, for example, when the caller is a child or it's someone having severe difficulty breathing, 911 operators cannot rely on height above ellipsoid-based location provided by the carrier for urgent response. In cases such as these, the height above ellipsoid technology could lead to loss of life. So let's be honest. If we can't get this right for New York, one of the cities where the case for vertical location is the clearest, it calls into question what we're even doing in the first place. Then remember that there are over 6,000 public safety answering points nationwide. There are more than 100,000 911 professionals who work in them day in, day out, taking every call with steely calm. They've been told they need to upgrade their systems to next generation 911, and that's going to cost $12 million. No one knows where this funding is going to come from, and yet now we at the FCC have tacked on a brand new obligation for 911 centers to take raw height above ellipsoid data and hope and pray they'll be able to translate it into something actionable. Third, we need to listen to public safety officials calling for useful information. 9 months ago, we acknowledged a hard truth. We recognize that vertical location measurement of plus or minus 3 meters is probably not good enough for police, firefighters, and emergency medical personnel trying to locate a 911 caller in crisis. As I said when it was first introduced, we should choose standards that without fail provide floor level accuracy. When police or firefighters show up in an emergency, the last thing they should have to do is take out a measuring tape. They need a standard that tells them precisely where you are. So 9 months ago, we sought comment on how to improve the plus or minus 3 meter margin of error. But instead of acting on this today, we kicked the can down the road and put off review of this standard until 2022. Why not do it right here, right now? After all, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, International Association of Firefighters, International Association of Chiefs of Police, National Sheriff's Association, and National Association of State EMS officials have all asked the agency to narrow this standard, or at a minimum, reassess it twice a year. I think we should have taken on this task today. In the end, I appreciate that the FCC is making an effort to tackle what is ultimately a challenging technical problem, and I thank the chairman for that. But I think we need to work harder to reduce the risk and uncertainty we're adding to this process. In a world with pandemics, natural disasters, and so many other threats, we need to make it simple to use 911 for everyone. There are no easy answers here, but sticking to the principles I outlined would help get us where we need to go. For this reason, I support our decision to extend 911 wireless location accuracy rules nationwide. But I think the opt-in approach to 911 we adopt is neither simple nor fair. It will leave behind too many people who call 911 in a crisis. Moreover, our continuing reliance on raw height above ellipsoid data fails to offer 911 operators the real-world actionable information they need to keep us safe. Finally, I think we should do more to provide useful information for public safety officials than the plus or minus 3 meter standard we stick to here. For these reasons, I approve in part and dissent in part.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Calls to 911 are often a matter of life or death. When seconds count, emergency responders may need to quickly find a caller who cannot provide their precise location to dispatchers. As the Commission has repeatedly affirmed, knowing a caller's vertical or Z-axis location may be critical in those situations, particularly in dense areas with lots of multi-story buildings. Today's decision is an important step towards ensuring that first responders will have Z-axis information when they need it. And while precise location information is critical to an effective emergency response, it can also be dangerous in the wrong hands. Over the last year, I have been pleased that my colleagues and I could work towards creating robust privacy safeguards for this sensitive location data. As I originally asked in a prior item, we have developed a regulatory framework for Z-axis and dispatchable location data that prevents abuse by wireless carriers as well as their third-party vendors. The notices of apparent liability we approved earlier this year against the big four carriers, AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, for misuse of customer location data should make clear that we will hold wireless carriers responsible if they fail to ensure that the vendors they choose comply with our privacy rules and adopt appropriate safeguards. Though I support today's action, I also recognize there is more to do. Based on the record in this proceeding, I'm confident that technological developments will soon enable us to tighten the requirements beyond plus or minus 3 meters. I will continue to encourage industry to step on the gas and working towards even more accurate solutions, and encourage the Commission to soon require even more precise Z-axis location information. We must remain focused on the ultimate goal, getting first responders to the precise location where they are needed. I also continue to highlight the importance of technology-neutral solutions. The progress many innovators have made using barometric pressure sensors is impressive, and those sensors will become more ubiquitous as costs continue to decrease. But we must recognize that not all devices, particularly the less expensive devices often offered by lifeline providers, contain barometric pressure sensors. As the item explains, there are technologies on the horizon that can provide Z-axis information even for these less expensive devices. The Commission should encourage the development of those solutions because if a speedy response in an emergency, it should not be a luxury. If, after the initial April 2021 deadline, it appears that Lifeline subscribers are not benefiting from our Z-Access rules, the Commission must consider additional rules to close that gap. As I have long said, life-saving technology needs to be available for all. Thank you to the Bureau for their work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. When you call 911, the response time can be the difference between life and death. That makes it crucial for first responders to be able to find you as soon as possible. But discerning your location can be challenging if you're in a multi-story building. And that's why last year, a bipartisan majority of the Commission adopted rules to require wireless carriers to meet a vertical location accuracy metric, or Z-axis. This Z-axis metric establishes requirements that are achievable and will provide first responders with valuable, life-saving information. These rules were supported by an impressive coalition of public safety organizations, including the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the International Association of Firefighters, and the National Emergency Numbering Association, the only professional organization in America focused solely on the needs of 911. Well, today we build upon last year's effort. For example, we look beyond the top 50 markets and require nationwide wireless providers to deploy Z-axis location technology or dispatchable location to all cellular market areas nationwide by April 2025. Non-nationwide providers will be given an extra year to meet this requirement. This will ensure that consumers and emergency personnel in both rural and urban America, not just our nation's largest metropolitan areas, will have the benefit of vertical location accuracy by a date certain. As was the case with last year's order, our action today is strongly supported by a broad coalition of public safety groups, including the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the International Association of Firefighters, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, and the National Association of State EMS Officials. These organizations say that the order, and I quote, will significantly improve emergency responders' ability to locate wireless 911 callers in the United States, and recognizes the urgency for strong vertical location accuracy rules that ensure that public safety can rely on location information provided by wireless carriers to better save lives across the nation. Well said, and I thank them for their support. Now, of course, much work will remain after today, so wireless carriers, the public safety community, Z-axis solution providers, device manufacturers, and others will have to work together in good faith to get the job done, and done on time. We owe it to the Americans who rely on their mobile phones to call 911 in an emergency. And we owe it to those courageous first responders who often risk their own lives to answer those calls. This item is an important milestone in our ongoing efforts to protect the safety of the American people. For their dedication in helping us reach this point, I want to express my gratitude to the staff of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, and the Office of Managing Director. With that, we will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Card.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve in part, dissent in part.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
As chair votes to approve as well, the item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, next on your agenda, item 5 is entitled Modernizing Priority Services Rules to Support Emergency Personnel. This item will also be presented by the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and once again, Lisa Folks, Chief of the Bureau, will introduce the item.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Folks, the floor is once again yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is critical that public safety, national security, and emergency preparedness personnel are able to communicate effectively during emergencies. To that end, 3 priority service programs provide priority access to landline and wireless networks, as well as service provisioning and restoration. The Commission's rules for these services, however, have not been updated in at least 20 years, and thus do not take into account the technological changes that our nation has experienced over that time. Today, we present a notice of proposed rulemaking to modernize and streamline the Commission's priority services rules by removing outdated requirements that may impede the use of advanced technologies. Today's item would ensure that priority service programs operate effectively and meet the needs of authorized users now and in the future. Joining me today from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau is Chris Mink, an attorney advisor in the Operations and Emergency Management Division. I would like to thank David Firth, Deb Jordan, Erica Olson, Justin Kane, Michael Connolly, Ken Burnley, and Tim Perrier from the Bureau for their hard work on this item. What can I possibly say about this team? You all know what I'm going to say. They rock. I would also like to thank the other bureaus and offices that contributed. Mr. Smink will now present the item.
Thank you, Chief Folks. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The Department of Homeland Security manages 3 priority services programs to help ensure that government officials and emergency personnel can effectively communicate during emergency situations. The Commission has rules governing 2 of these programs. Those rules, however, have not been updated in at least 20 years. The first program is the Telecommunications Service Priority System, or TSP, which requires service providers to prioritize the provisioning and restoration of wired communications and facilities. The second program is the Wireless Priority Service, or WPS, which is a voluntary program that allows service providers to prioritize voice calls on wireless networks. The third program is the Government Emergency Telecommunications Service, or GETS, which is a voluntary program that allows service providers to prioritize voice calls on landline networks. There are, however, no Commission rules for GETS, which operates strictly via contractual arrangements between the Department of Homeland Security and service providers. As the Commission's rules for TSP and WPS were developed when communications networks were primarily based on legacy technologies, today's item would modernize these rules by removing outdated requirements that may impede the use of Internet Protocol-based technologies. It would further amend the Commission's rules to reflect the current administrative responsibilities for the priority services programs, while also eliminating burdensome administrative requirements that are no longer needed. Finally, it would respond to 2 petitions for rulemaking from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security, requesting the Commission update its priority services rules. The Bureau recommends adoption of this notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair. It is common sense, not to mention good government practice, to regularly review the Commission's priority service regulations, which ensure that critical calls related to national security go through during emergencies when our networks are most likely to be congested. In the time since our last review, much has changed in how people communicate, especially with the introduction of IP-based technologies that permit data, video, and IP voice services. While I look forward to reviewing the comments from the outset, I see much benefit to and heartily endorse the alternative approach outlined in this notice, which would convert our regulatory framework from these programs to a market-based, light touch approach. GETS is a voluntary service and operates solely through contractual arrangements between DHS and telecommunications providers. It's proven successful and is far preferable over the other current structures for TSP or WPS. If our rules are germane in whole or part, there must be oversight over the DHS selected entities or entities that manage these programs. I hear from providers, even when voluntarily, they feel obligated to participate for public and government relation reasons without any ability to provide much input. We must ensure that they have a means to raise concerns and grievances if arise. Additionally, I note that the item proposes to acknowledge that service providers can and already are providing TSP type services for data, video, and IP-based voice services on a voluntary basis through contractual agreements. Let me be clear. If rules are eventually adopted here, I will ensure that nothing jeopardizes or infringes upon the Title I status of these information services. Regardless, avoiding this jurisdictional mess is yet another reason to move to an entirely contract-based approach that does not involve the Commission in any way. I thank the Chair for bringing this item to a vote, and I will approve. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Since at least the 1980s, our country's national security personnel have had access to priority services programs to ensure that their critical communications needs will be met during a national emergency. These programs cover everything from prioritized connections during high call volume moments to the quick restoration of damaged or degraded lines. Today, we launch a rulemaking that looks at whether we should update any of those rules in light of changes in technology. As we start this proceeding, I want to thank my colleagues for agreeing to a number of changes to the notice. As originally drafted, the notice suggested that national security personnel would be prevented from obtaining priority services for modern internet-based services unless we adopted rules expressly authorizing the provision of those services. But that doesn't square with the reason why the FCC adopted this regulatory framework in the first place. The FCC didn't adopt the priority services rules based on a determination that telecom carriers would refuse to provide priority treatment to national security personnel in the absence of those rules. Rather, the FCC adopted these regulations based on a concern that without them, Section 202's non-discrimination requirement would operate to prevent carriers from voluntarily offering priority treatment. In this way, our existing rules are basically a safe harbor that offer carriers a defense to a claim that they're offering priority services in violation of Title II's non-discrimination requirements. Since those Title II obligations do not apply to the IP or internet-based offerings we examine here, I want to make sure that our notice reflected the idea that providers and national security personnel face no apparent regulatory barrier to contracting for priority treatment. In fact, I'm inclined to view a contractual, or what we call in the item a gets-based approach, more favorably than extending some of our reticulated TSP or WPS rules to modern next-gen IP offerings. So I look forward to reviewing the record as it develops on those issues, and I'm happy to cast my vote for the revised item. Thank you to the Public Safety Bureau for your work. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
With this rulemaking, the FCC kicks off an effort to update its policies for priority communications in times of national emergency. This is important because it has been decades since we examined these rules. And in that time, the way we communicate in crisis has changed in a big way. The number of switched access lines has precipitously declined, while internet-based forms of communication have been on the rise. As a result, I support today's effort because it can help ensure that old voice-centric rules evolve in our new data-centric world. Of course, this is not the only place that we should be seeking to make such changes. When it comes to service outages, the FCC still only requires reporting on voice services. That just doesn't make sense. We are in the middle of a pandemic, living our lives online, and yet our rules governing communications outages are stuck in the era of basic telephone lines. They need an update. They need to include broadband reporting outages too. And a proposal to address this gap in our reporting system has been pending for 4 years. It needs our attention and action. Finally, I appreciate that with this rulemaking, the FCC is acting in response to not one, but 2 petitions from the NTIA. Later this month, we expect to receive another petition from our NTIA colleagues at the Department of Commerce. Pursuant to last month's executive order, they will ask this agency to develop rules about when and how social media companies will be protected under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act for online content. But let's not take that bait. While social media is frustrating, turning the FCC into the president's speech police is not the answer. If we honor the Constitution, we will dismiss this petition immediately.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over 2 hours into a meeting here, we've heard a lot of words. We have not heard these words. There's no statement from me on this item. Thank you to the team for the hard work.
Thank you, Commissioner. Not only have we now heard them, we will hear them again. I will forego a statement. Well, that will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
And the chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item will be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled Leased Commercial Access, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative. Michelle Carey, Chief of the Media Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Carey, if you are there, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The Media Bureau presents a second report and order that modifies our lease access requirements, which implement the statutory requirement that cable operators set aside channel capacity for commercial use by unaffiliated video programmers. To date, the Commission has undertaken 22 proceedings as part of its media modernization effort, and this order represents the 41st item adopted by the Commission as part of that effort. Joining me online is Diana Sokolow of the Policy Division. She will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, I am pleased to present this second report and order that adopts the proposal to implement a simplified tier-specific leased access fee calculation pursuant to the Communication Act's directive to establish maximum reasonable leased access rates. Currently, the average implicit fee, which is the maximum rate per month that a cable operator may charge a leased access programmer, involves a complicated calculation that looks at rates across all tiers and utilizes a weighting scheme. Revising the calculation to be specific to the tier on which the leased access programmer seeks carriage will have several benefits. First, it will be a more accurate approximation of the value of a particular channel. Second, it will reflect regulatory changes that have occurred in the more than 20 years since the rate regulation regime was originally adopted. Third, it will ease burdens on cable operators. Today's order also codifies the determination set forth in the Commission's 1993 rate regulation order that the average implicit fee is calculated annually based on contracts in effect in the previous calendar year. Finally, this item finds that the video programming marketplace has changed significantly since the constitutionality of the leased access mandate was upheld. These marketplace changes include the increased use and availability of the internet and increased competition from multi-channel video programming distributors and online video distributors. These developments have eroded the original justification for the leased access rules, which was to safeguard competition and diversity due to cable operators' monopoly power at the time the rules were adopted. Although the item finds that these changes have cast substantial doubt on the constitutionality of the mandatory leased access statute, because these rules are required pursuant to a specific statutory mandate from Congress, we do not eliminate or decline to enforce them. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the second report and order and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sokolow, both for that compelling presentation and the calming background. Very nicely done. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair. I'm just going to correct myself and say I'm going to have to submit a longer statement for the last item, and for this one, I'm going to submit my statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Carr, I believe you're on mute.
That was my best content that I already delivered. So, all right, buckle up here. The Supreme Court and DC Circuit have long recognized that leased access and related requirements impinge on free speech. They do so in several ways, including by requiring cable providers to carry speech they might not otherwise choose to distribute. As a result, courts have consistently applied heightened First Amendment scrutiny to these types of provisions. And in the past, they've upheld the requirements against constitutional challenges based in no small part on the market conditions that prevailed in the 80s and 90s when Congress passed and later amended the statutory least access requirements. Back then, cable providers accounted for 98% of the pay TV market. So Congress enacted these laws to disrupt the, quote, bottleneck monopoly that cable providers used to possess over the distribution of video content. Flash forward to today, and the market for distributing video content is drastically different. The monopoly conditions that courts relied on to uphold least access and its intrusion on free speech are gone. And that's why at the outset of this proceeding, I urge my colleagues to seek comment on the First Amendment implications of the least access regime. I'm glad that we did, because as the order now finds, marketplace changes have in fact eroded the original justification for least access. Indeed, when Congress passed the least access regime, consumers basically had just 3 options for video content: over-the-air television, video cassettes, or cable. There was no internet, not as we know it today. There were no DBS providers, and telcos were legally prohibited from offering video programming. The pay TV market looks nothing like it did back then. Where cable once accounted for 98% of the market, the facts have flipped. Over 99% of US households now have access to at least 3 pay TV options. In fact, 2 of the top 4 largest pay TV providers are satellite companies that didn't even exist when Congress passed the '92 Cable Act. Or consider how this great video content we're offering the public right now is being distributed: the internet. The dramatic rise of online platforms over the last decade fundamentally transformed the way Americans access content. Sling and Hulu provide linear programming alternatives. Disney Plus and Amazon Prime provide access to large video libraries and original content alike. Or take Netflix, which didn't begin its streaming services until 15 years after the '92 Cable Act was passed. It now has more US subscribers than the top 3 pay TV services combined. But while the media marketplace has changed dramatically over the past 20 or 30 years, one thing's remained constant: there's very little demand for least access. The DC Circuit and Time Warner noted that the least access regime enacted in 1984, quote, did not accomplish much. And the regime that emerged from the '92 Cable Act steadfastly carried on that tradition. Only a government program could exist for so long while accomplishing so little. Despite its ineffectiveness, the regime continues to impose significant First Amendment burdens and other real-world costs. And this is a point the DC Circuit and Time Warner didn't seem to fully appreciate. In that decision, the court suggested that cable operators would be largely insulated from any significant burden on their First Amendment rights because very few entities would actually invoke the least access regime. But that contention ignores several key points. For one, the regime imposes costs on cable providers even in the absence of a single request for least access. For example, cable operators must maintain and update dedicated network infrastructure, and the least access regime inhibits their ability to offer consumers tailored programming tiers, or what we call now skinny bundles, an option that many of their competitors in the video marketplace enjoy because they're not subject to the statutory least access regime. The asymmetrical and anti-competitive element of this federal regime adds even more weight to the First Amendment concerns. Ultimately, the entire and in fact express purpose of the least access regime is to interfere with free speech. It requires cable operators to carry content they would decline to carry in an ordinary market-based negotiation. Yet the factual basis that Congress and the courts have relied on to justify this infringement is gone. The market for video programming is no longer marked by scarcity or a cable bottleneck, but by vibrant competition that benefits both consumers and programmers alike. All of this, my long windup included, leads to a question. How should the commission proceed in this case? And this is where I reach a slightly different conclusion than the order, which is why I'm concurring in the decision today. The order finds that the constitutionality of least access regime is in substantial doubt. It then determines that decisions about the constitutionality of congressional enactments are generally outside the purview of agencies. And as a result, it proceeds as if the statutory requirements are constitutional and ultimately adopts a new tier-based rate for least access. It's really this last part where I would have taken a slightly different approach than the order. While we can't remove the least access statute from the United States Code, I don't think we should proceed in this case as if there's no serious constitutional question. Instead, we should adopt a rule that provides cable operators with maximum flexibility, given the serious First Amendment concerns at issue. We could have done so here by adopting the market-based rule that commenters proposed in the record that would have provided even more relief than the tier-based rule we adopt. I'm guided in my thinking here by what some might refer to in the judicial context as the doctrine of constitutional avoidance. It flows from Supreme Court cases like DeBartolo, and in a nutshell, courts will construe a statute to avoid constitutional problems unless such a construction is plainly contrary to the statute. Applying that type of concept here, we should have gone further given the serious First Amendment questions surrounding the least access regime. None of this is to say that the tier-based rate the order adopts is irrational. I think it's an eminently reasonable rule and one that improves on the rate formula that it replaces, putting the First Amendment concerns to the side. I would go further because I think a market-based rule is also a permissible way for us to implement the statute, and one that would bend our decision even further away from the constitutional concerns. With that said, I do want to express my thanks and appreciation to the Media Bureau for their hard work on the item and throughout this entire proceeding. They've performed yeoman's work, and their effort will leave the least access regime in far better shape. So thank you to all of them for your work.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Well, in the interest of moving things along, I will just say I will concur and not read a statement at this time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Democracy requires that the public have access to diverse sources of information. Recognizing this imperative, Congress created the commercial least access regime to, quote, promote competition in the delivery of diverse resources of video programming and to assure the widest possible diversity of information sources are made available to the public from cable systems in a manner consistent with growth and development of cable systems, close quote. The rules establishing maximum reasonable least access rates are a core part of this mission, ensuring that unaffiliated video programmers can compete on fair terms. And with this action, the Commission simplifies the calculation of maximum least access rates by adopting a tier-based formula that better reflects the value of a particular channel to the programmer seeking carriage. I agree with commenters that this modification should make compliance less burdensome, particularly for small cable operators. Despite the robust discussion among commenters in the record about the First Amendment implications of the least access regime, we wisely declined to pass on the constitutionality of this congressional mandate. No doubt, the marketplace has undergone significant changes since the least access requirements were last updated, with many more options available for viewing content from over-the-top providers and other online sources. But as we make clear in myriad other decisions, not everyone in America is connected to broadband or has available options for viewing content beyond over-the-air broadcast television and perhaps one cable or satellite provider in their local market. Moreover, there remains a huge disparity in the number of media outlets owned and controlled by people of color and women, which often translate to a lack of locally relevant and diverse programming. I therefore disagree with the part of the majority to the extent that it suggests that we have done the requisite analysis to conclude that competition has eroded the original justification for the least access rules, in particular with regard to the need to safeguard diversity. We have done no such analysis in my view. I believe the Commission's time is better spent focusing on efforts to expand the reach of high-speed broadband to end disparities in media ownership, rather than gratuitously seeking to eliminate statutory protections that are specifically designed to promote and preserve diverse programming sources. For that reason, I will concur. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Like Commissioner O'Reilly, I will forego a statement. I will also observe, as he did, that I had a longer statement on the previous item that we will enter into the record. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr, sorry.
Concur.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Concur.
Commissioner Starks.
Concur.
And the chair votes to approve. The item is adopted.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
We might need the advice of I just would like an opinion from the general counsel. If we have 3 concurrences, what does that say about the text of this item?
Ms. Boiselle.
So the question is, has the item been adopted as is?
Well, it seems to me if 3 out of the 5 of us only concur in the result, the substantive text of the item is under question. I don't know if the agency has had that happen before, and I'd like to understand if that actually means adoption or not.
Well, I think I'm going to have to get back to you on that because I think it depends on what portions of the item the 3 concurrences are addressing.
Okay, that's fair. I appreciate that, but I want to make clear I'm concurring to the entire item, and I think we should probably clarify among my colleagues what their concurrences are, because then the entire text of the item, if there are only 3 concurrences, has no substantive meaning.
I appreciate the question. We'll certainly get back to you. I don't know if the commissioners want to clarify the scope of their concurrences at this time.
How about this?
I would ask that we hold off on making the ultimate decision about whether or not this is adopted until we have an opinion from the general counsel's office.
Why don't we do this? We will ask the Office of General Counsel to take a look, hold the item temporarily in abeyance, and as soon as we get an opinion from the Office of General Counsel, we'll take the appropriate action.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that's the right thing to do.
All right. With that, Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the last item, item 7, will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau and is entitled Establishing the Digital Opportunity Data Collection, Modernizing the FCC Form 477 Data Program. And Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, is back to give the introduction.
All right, you played lead off and now you're playing cleanup. Thank you, Ms. Monteith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to you and to all of the commissioners. The Wireline Competition Bureau, Office of Economics and Analytics, Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and International Bureau are pleased to present for your consideration a second report and order and third notice of proposed rulemaking that, if adopted, would continue the Commission's efforts to improve our broadband data and maps. I would like to thank the entire Bureau team for their hard work on this item, as well as the teams from the Office of OEA, Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, International Bureau, and Office of General Counsel for all of their help. This truly was a team effort. Online with me today is Michael Ray, Attorney Advisor in the Wireline Competition Bureau's Competition Policy Division. Mike will now present the item.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today's second report and order and third further notice of proposed rulemaking, if adopted, would take critical steps to collect and verify improved, more precise data on both fixed and mobile broadband availability. The item fulfills requirements relating to the collection of data on broadband services established by the Broadband Deployment Accuracy and Technological Availability Act, enacted in March of this year. The second report and order and third further notice largely builds on the Commission's August 2019 report and order that established the digital opportunity data collection. If adopted, the second report and order would establish important measures for developing improved broadband data, including requiring fixed wireline and satellite providers to submit shapefiles or lists of addresses or locations representing where they can have customers or could install service within 10 business days of a request. Requiring terrestrial fixed wireless providers to report their coverage areas based on propagation maps and models using prescribed parameters, or based on lists of addresses or locations, to define their specific coverage areas. Requiring all fixed providers to provide details on the methodology used to determine their reported coverage, and requiring mobile providers to submit coverage maps and propagation model details based on minimum specified parameters and to disclose other assumptions underlying the models. In addition, the second report and order includes a provision for the Commission to establish a common data set of all locations in the United States where fixed broadband service can be installed, known as the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. The order also would adopt processes for verifying the accuracy of providers' broadband data, including the collection of crowdsourced data and the use of regular audits to examine provider data. The third further notice of proposed rulemaking, if adopted, would seek comment on a range of additional measures to implement the requirements of the Broadband Data Act, including adopting additional safeguards and standards for mobile data reporting and verification measures, such as drive testing, requiring the submission of mobile infrastructure data, requiring certification by an engineer of coverage data submissions, developing a process for parties to challenge the fixed and mobile availability data, administering the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, enforcing the new reporting standards, and creating the coverage maps. The Wireline Competition Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and the International Bureau recommend adoption of the second report and order and third further notice of proposed rulemaking, and request editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thanks.
Thank you for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair. Some of my devices are failing me in terms of battery capability, so I'll try to do the best I can. I hope you all can hear me still. The final item for consideration is perhaps one of the most important ones we will consider this year. Some would argue, and I certainly can sympathize with this perspective, that the item should have been at front and center on today's agenda and not relegated to the very end of the meeting, no matter where it falls on the July list of items. Fixing the Commission's maps, which are woefully inadequate for determining broadband coverage and service, remains a critical priority for the Commission. Thanks to Congress's successful bipartisan effort to fix the FCC's broken mapping, we are finally taking affirmative steps to fix the situation. It never should have come to this. For years, maybe even a decade or more, almost everyone has acknowledged that the Form 477 data was deficient to determine broadband coverage in America. That's because the specific data collection was never meant to be used for this purpose and provided at best just a raw snapshot of a provider's coverage. For instance, it served our purpose for constructing model-based support and tracking year-to-year progress in deployment. Unfortunately, when policymakers and even consumers began asking, and in many cases demanding, more accurate data, we didn't pivot fast enough or with sufficient resolve to meet the real need. Today, we restart the process of climbing out of the tremendous hole we've dug. Hopefully, we are doing so consistent with Congress's direction, which made a number of corrective changes to the data collection path we set upon just last year, for example, requiring the establishment of a serviceable location fabric for fixed broadband and precluding the Commission from delegating its mapping responsibilities under the Act to USAC. At the same time, Congress expected the Commission to use the new maps for future decision-making and not rush ahead in providing new subsidy programs absent this important data. The law is fairly clear on this point, but in case it wasn't, I've heard directly from a number of senators on exactly what they expect from the Commission, and I intend to follow their expectations. In terms of fixing our data deficiencies, I'm grateful to the chairman for accepting some of my requests to improve the item, particularly my request to adopt more realistic maximum buffers for wireline networks and vastly paring down or seeking further comment on the colossally burdensome and highly sensitive infrastructure information being requested from wireless providers, and at very least to treat this information as presumably confidential. The revised draft now appropriately reevaluates and the need for such sensitive information, and I'm grateful that our offices were able to work again together to find a suitable landing spot. This approach is consistent with my longstanding philosophy that reporting requirements should not be unduly burdensome, as I've worked to minimize and eliminate unnecessary reporting across our rules, including in proceedings related to our disaster information reporting system, submarine cable data, rate of return regulation, and our KidVid rules. In fact, for those with time on their hands, I've even wrote a couple of blogs on the topic. Speaking of my regulatory philosophy, the initially circulated draft was also at odds with my approach for delegation by punting certain major future decisions to commission staff, or in other words, leaving significant future decisions completely up to the chair, effectively cutting out commissioners of the process. I thank Chairman Pai for agreeing to adopt my edits to eliminate certain inappropriate delegations and ensuring our mapping decisions go forward are transparent and accountable. In the end, I'm hopeful that we are turning the corner on the Commission's inaccurate mapping problems, and that the products of these efforts will allow us to make better decisions on how best to bring service to those remaining unserved Americans. And I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Sorry, almost forgot to unmute again. Make sure I have the right item up. Okay. As we make more and more progress in closing the digital divide, it becomes more and more important that we identify with precision the homes and businesses that still lack access to high-speed internet. This will ensure that we target our efforts and focus our universal service programs on extending internet infrastructure to the families that live and work in those communities. There's now bipartisan agreement that doing this requires better maps. The FCC's now infamous, I should say, Form 477 dates back roughly 20 years. It was never designed to produce the type of granular data needed to generate detailed broadband coverage maps. And when the FCC updated Form 477 in years past, it declined to collect data at a more granular level than the census block. This has led to some gaps in our data, as areas without broadband service can be counted as served under the existing approach. Going forward, we need to get better data. And that's why Chairman Pai decided in 2017 to start the process that could produce those maps. His early efforts on this front are paying off, as the Commission took a pivotal step in 2019 when we adopted the Digital Opportunity Data Collection. This collection will allow us to take steps to develop a nationwide map that will have unprecedented detail. Congress largely codified those FCC efforts when it passed the Broadband Data Act in March of 2020. So today we take the next step in our work to stand up detailed coverage maps with the backing and guidance by Congress in the Data Act. As we do so, I want to thank my colleagues for agreeing to some significant changes to our decision. As originally drafted, the order imposed essentially two sets of requirements on mobile wireless providers. One set of rules flows largely from mandates Congress included in the Data Act. Those obligations require carriers to submit standardized predictive propagation maps, and they require details on everything from cell edge probability and cell loading to clutter factors and propagation models. In a separate section, the draft order required carriers to provide over a dozen sets of network infrastructure information. Given the potential overlap between those two sets of information collections, I asked my colleagues to move the infrastructure section from the order to the further notice. And I very much appreciate that my colleagues agreed to this request, because this will allow us some additional time to ensure that any additional infrastructure reporting requirements line up with the information we're already going to collect through our Data Act requirements. I'm also pleased that we've made clear that while this information is of great public importance, providers can still seek confidential treatment for sensitive information. With these changes, I'm happy to approve of the decision. So I want to thank the Wireline Bureau, the Wireless Bureau, and OEA for their hard work on it. It has my support. It also may be helpful for me to go back and address the prior statement, given some of the concerns that were raised, and I can understand why the casting and the characterization of my vote could cause some confusion. So I want to sort of go back to what I think I said at the end of my statement, which is I agree with the FCC's decision, with the order's decision to replace the existing rule on the book and to swap that rule out with the rate tier. My point with the concurrence was to explain that I would go further and also would have been willing, given the significant constitutional concerns, to adopt a market-based rule. But I do approve of the decision to go from the existing rule to the rate-based rule. So I'm happy to have the vote line reflect perhaps more accurately what I intended to convey with my positioning on that statement. So to approve of our decision, of course, to move from the existing rate to the new rate, which means I approve of everything that's in the decision. The concurrence is simply, or I should say the concurrence in part, is simply to explain, again, that based on the First Amendment concerns, I would have been willing, if we'd had more votes for it potentially, to go even further than what was in the decision. So hopefully that clarification addresses some of the issues arising out of that past one. I think maybe the way I phrased it could have created some issues, but hopefully that addresses those issues.
Thank you, Commissioner. Ms. Boiselle, with that explanation, is it your view that the previous item has been adopted?
Yes, with that clarification, there are 3 votes for the item at least. So I would say that.
Can I point out that if there are 3 concurrences, I don't think we can concur to something that doesn't exist. So the concurrence relates to the text of the item. I'd still like you to review the record of the agency and provide us with a formal opinion, just to be doubly sure.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
To be clear, we've repeatedly seen concurrences to stuff that's not in the item. So anyway, in any case, we'll have the Office of General Counsel track it down. But based on the opinion from the Office of General Counsel, the item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Let's see. Oh, Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Yeah. In 1993, the novelist William Gibson is reported to have said, "The future is here, it's just not very evenly distributed." Recall at that time, accessing the internet meant the hiss and ding of a dial-up modem. Mobile phones were the size of a brick, and real bragging rights came with every visit to the World Wide Web. But in many ways, Gibson's commentary is the most honest thing you can say about broadband today. The future of broadband is here, but it's not evenly distributed. There are communities in this country with blazing fast gigabit speeds, and areas where buffering means suffering, and still others where there is no service to be found at all. The sad truth is that the FCC does not know with precision where those areas are. We don't know where broadband is and is not across this country. We don't know with accuracy what areas have wired service. We don't know with accuracy what areas have wireless service. If you think that's crazy, you're right. We're in this mess because for the last several years, we have failed to put in place the kind of updated broadband collection that would yield accurate and honest data about where service is located. The agency tried a year ago with its digital opportunity data collection, but then nothing happened. In fact, during the last 3 years, we have made almost no changes to our data gathering process, despite pleas from consumers who are angry that our existing maps say they have service when they know all too well they do not, despite pleas from state and local officials that we have our facts wrong, and despite nearly identical pleas from federal officials, including one cabinet secretary who dismissed FCC maps as fake news. But no more. That's because Congress finally told us to clean up our act in the Broadband Data Act. So that's what we do here. We implement this new law, and we mostly get it right. We require carriers to produce granular data about where they are able to provide both wired and wireless services. Then we commit to checking and validating this information in part through the use of crowdsourcing. This is so smart because we are using the wisdom of the crowd. There are people across this country who want to help and are willing to participate. And as we go forward, we need to make it simple for them, as well as our state, local, and tribal partners to do so. To this end, our rulemaking asks important questions about how the challenge process will work and how we can offer technical assistance to those in need. I'm pleased it also asks about an idea I offered long ago, a pilot program to take advantage of existing services like postal trucks that crisscross rural communities every day and could help us perfect our new maps. After all, this is a big undertaking and we need to get working because statutory deadlines loom. But there is one thing we surely get wrong. We are going to gather all of this precision data about where broadband is and is not, but we are not going to use any of it this fall when we distribute $16 billion in funding for improved broadband services across the country. In fact, the way this works is that less than 1 week before the election, the FCC will distribute 80% of these broadband funds for the next decade. If you think that sounds irresponsible, you're right. Because when a major trade association studied the accuracy of our existing data and maps, the ones we're using to distribute these funds, it found an error rate of nearly 2 in 5. None of us would ever invest our own funds this way. We shouldn't be so cavalier with public dollars, especially when they are being spent to solve the digital divide and make sure the future is more evenly distributed. So we have this backwards. We are giving out funding before rolling up our sleeves and doing the hard work to fix our maps. In the end, that is my primary concern with our efforts today. For too long, we have accepted the fact that our data is wrong and ignored the fact that it limits our ability to target policy solutions effectively. I appreciate that we make changes today, but I regret that it took an act of Congress to force us to do so. For these reasons, I approve in part and dissent in part.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It has been nearly 6 months since the COVID-19 pandemic reached the United States. In that time, our way of life has been transformed. For millions of Americans, work duties, educational resources, and healthcare have all moved online. Our networks have accordingly faced unprecedented demand, but not from the millions of others who do not have high-quality broadband at home. From the widespread imposition of stay-at-home orders to the anticipated need for remote instruction from many schools in the fall, we have more than enough evidence that we must address the digital divide right now. And to meet that challenge, we must have accurate data. As I have said many times, we are leaving real people behind knowingly when we make funding decisions based on data that blinds us to the reality of internet inequality in so many places. Earlier this year, I argued against spending 3/4 of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund based on our existing flawed data. And I will continue to oppose efforts to rush the 5G fund out the door without first fixing our maps. We have for years spent, and because of RDOF, will for the next decade spend billions and billions of dollars without a comprehensive understanding of where broadband is and is not. Without doubt, today marks the beginning of the end of that era. I wish we had acted sooner. I am glad that Congress created a clear deadline and expectations in the Broadband Data Act. Today's order is an important step on the path that Congress has laid out. I appreciate the efforts of the many parties that proposed refinements to the reporting standards we adopt today. I was particularly concerned about the buffer size proposed in the draft order and that it was incompatible with industry standards for rural fiber deployment and might inadvertently increase the cost by encouraging the use of unnecessary aggregation points. The version we adopt today better reflects the capabilities of today's rural fiber networks. I'm also pleased that we established mapping parameters for 5G in our services. We will soon need that data to ensure that all Americans share the benefit of a 5G future. Still, our work is not complete, and the Broadband Data Act requires more than rules the Commission adopts here today. And so in particular, Congress has mandated rigorous challenge and verification processes, and we will need robust engagement from parties in the coming weeks before we can finalize those procedures before our statutory deadline. I will be particularly focused on suggestions for improving our coordination with state and local governments. Those entities have provided a badly needed check on our past challenge processes. We will need their assistance, and it is regrettable that we did not move sooner to fulfill that statutory duty under our obligations in the Broadband Data Act. The result, I do fear, will require those parties and other interested parties to yet again act fast with their backs against the wall and billions of federal dollars at stake. Once these rules are established and the Broadband Data Act's deadlines are satisfied, we must keep our sense of urgency. Solving internet inequality requires a clear and complete understanding of the challenges we face, something we will not have until revised maps are released. Thank you to the staff and the commission who worked and came together to produce this item. I will concur.
Thank you, Commissioner. Closing the digital divide has been my top priority as chairman of the FCC. And we've been moving forward over the past 3 years with bold steps to connect Americans we know are currently unserved. The Commission's existing broadband coverage maps have allowed us to identify the least served parts of this country, such as the more than 5.3 million rural homes and businesses that could receive a broadband connection as a result of the upcoming Phase 1 of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. But as we continue our efforts to bring digital opportunity to every American consumer, we'll need more granular and precise maps to know exactly where broadband is and where it is not. And this is especially true for partially served census blocks, areas in which some locations have broadband, but others don't. And in this regard, we recognize that we cannot go it alone, but rather must rely in part on those who live and work in these areas to tell us what the facts are on the ground and to help make our maps more accurate and reliable. And that's why in 2017, I proposed to update the approach to mapping adopted under the prior administration and why we adopted the Digital Opportunity Data Collection this past August. Specifically, we approved a three-pronged approach to broadband mapping. First, service providers who have the best information on the design and location of their networks would give the FCC granular information about the areas where they make service available. Second, the FCC would develop a database of all locations where broadband connections might be needed and overlay it upon the coverage information from service providers. And third, the FCC would empower individual consumers, along with state and local and tribal governments and other entities, to contribute to the maps and provide feedback on their accuracy. In March of this year, Congress passed the Broadband Data Act, largely ratifying our three-pronged approach to broadband mapping. Today, we take the next step in developing the new broadband maps and implementing the Broadband Data Act. We build on the approach we adopted last August for fixed and mobile broadband mapping. We provide flexibility to providers to design their networks as they see fit, while still ensuring that coverage maps accurately reflect where consumers can expect to have access in the real world. We do that by allowing service providers to use the information they have about where they can provide service within guardrails that we impose to prevent providers from overstating coverage, and requiring transparency from providers so that Commission staff and the public can see how the maps were created and target efforts to verify the coverage maps to those areas where problems are most likely to arise. And we take steps to allow consumers, governments, and other entities to directly participate in the map-making process and seek comment on the best way to gather and incorporate that feedback into the maps. All of these measures will result in accurate and precise maps that will allow us to make sure that when a provider says it covers an area, we can be confident that service is actually available. And if the maps indicate that service isn't available, we'll have additional actionable data that we can use to target assistance and further promote broadband deployment. But unfortunately, not all the news on the mapping front is positive. While today's item is a significant step forward that sets many of the standards for the next generation of broadband maps, Congress has yet to provide the funding that we need for implementing the necessary systems for collecting and processing providers' coverage data, for developing the nationwide fabric of serviceable locations, or for conducting the in-depth verification and challenge processes that will ensure the reliability of the maps. In fact, in the Broadband Data Act, Congress actually took away from us the only source of funding that was available for this vital work by prohibiting the Universal Service Administrative Company from being involved in this project. The solution to this problem is obvious. As I said repeatedly, and as we have warned since the fall of 2019, Congress must give us the resources we need to implement the Broadband Data Act. Or, to put it another way, we need money before maps. dollars before data. If we get it, we'll be able to do the hard work of producing broadband availability maps with unprecedented detail, which will boost our efforts to close the digital divide. My thanks to the staff in every corner of this agency that contributed to the item, including the Wireline Competition Bureau, Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the International Bureau, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Office of Managing Director, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Security Bureau, and the Office of General Counsel. This item has my support. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve, and to go back to the well one last time, I just want to make it clear in case there's confusion. The official vote system reflects my view on that earlier item. It reflects in approve in part, concur in part. So I'm approve here, and as the system right now already reflects, approve in part, concur in part on that prior item.
Okay, got it. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
With respect to the mapping item, approve in part, dissent in part.
Commissioner Starks.
Yes, on the mapping item, concur.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Do any of my colleagues have any announcements they'd like to? Commissioner Rosenworcel. Oh, I believe you're muted. Sorry.
This one's a little sad, but a little bit happy too. I want to announce that Jessica Martinez, who has been my special advisor and has graced the halls of the FCC and helped me immeasurably, will be leaving my office to grace the hallowed halls of Congress. She will be moving on to becoming the legislative director for Congressman Mark Veazey from Texas. And his name might sound familiar because he is on the Energy and Commerce Committee at the House of Representatives. And he is also the individual on that committee who was charged with updating the Lifeline program in the HEROES Act. And just yesterday had a piece of legislation on media diversity move through the committee. So Jessica is in it, and she will be hopefully taking what she has been able to learn about at the agency on to Congress. And also, I'm going to miss her so much personally. She is a dynamo. She's got energy to spare. She understands the House of Representatives like no one I've met. And she has worked for me on a whole bunch of interesting issues and also accompanied me on some amazing travels, like heading to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and visiting tribal lands in New Mexico, and closer to home, working on census matters in Prince George's County, Maryland. She also, and I feel like this is amazing, in addition to taking a job with me, she somehow managed over the course of almost a year to have a child, get married, and also buy a home. So this is someone who can do lots of things and lives like there's more than 24 hours in a day. And she's going to be incredible in Congressman Veazey's office. And so we send her off with all sorts of affection. And I really appreciate the time that she spent in my office. She's not just a colleague, she's also a friend. Thank you, Jessica.
Amen to that. And you left off one of her important credentials, of course, which was being in our fantasy football league. We'll explore whether inter-branch
invited her, but not me. What's up with that? Did you?
All I can tell you, she and Travis are dedicated competitors in the league. Sorry, Commissioner Starks, I think I saw your hand up.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to Jessica on that new adventure. And we'll look forward to more great things from her. I'll shoot her a note as well. Briefly, because it's been a long day already, I have two new interns who have virtually joined the team. Happy to welcome Danuta Eagle, who's a rising 2L at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She previously worked on how the digital divide impacts immigrants and indigenous persons across various countries. And additionally, I have Michael Inseki Frank, who was born and raised in Oregon. He attended the University of Oregon, where he received a degree in math and economics. He's currently a 3L at my alma mater, Yale. Thank you.
Sorry, Commissioner O'Reilly or Commissioner Carr?
Yeah, I jump in here. Just two things. One, congratulations to Jessica. I know she'll do well in that setting. And then two, we're 1 week away from the CBRS auction. So everyone get ready. That's all I've got.
That's right. And thank you for your work on that, Commissioner O'Reilly. I know it's been a long road, but we're almost at the end of that road. So I have a number of announcements, and I apologize in advance, but a lot's been going on. So first and most excitingly, we have a birth in OCH. Our executive assistant, Deanne Irwin, had a baby girl a few weeks back, actually a couple of months back now, I guess it is, 2 months today. May Margreca Taylor, who was born on May 16th, weighing in at 6 pounds, 12 ounces. She was 20 inches long. I guess you might say, in our metric at least, that's one Reese's mug. So we're very happy about that. Congratulations to Deanne, and I wish you and your family all the best in the exciting time ahead. Next, in the Office of the Chairman, Melissa Kirkle came to us from the Wireline Competition Bureau. She's been handling the 988 order for us and doing a fantastic job. As I said, she was a deputy division chief in WCB. Prior to that, she went to some school that I understand is apparently accredited in New Haven, Connecticut. And then after that, went to Boston University for her JD. Hey, sorry, Jeffrey, I had to get into that point there. Also, going to OGC, Tom Johnson and his lovely wife, Catherine Beck, had a baby, Caroline Lucy Johnson, born on Thursday, July 9th, 2020. She weighs, again, 6 pounds and 9 ounces, also 20 inches long. So we're very, very excited about Tom. We'll get to see how much fealty she shows to the state of New Jersey in the time to come. Acting in her stead, as has been apparent today, since she's been on the meeting panel, is Ashley Boisel, is now the acting general counsel, has been just a superstar as the head of the litigation group in Office of General Counsel. Before that, she held the most important job at the commission, deputy general counsel in charge of the administrative law division. And she's now supervising the overall general counsel's office, doing a fantastic job, as I said. Next, going to the Public Safety Bureau, an old friend of mine, Nikki McGinnis, had a baby. Maxwell Alexander Chapin McGinnis was born July 13th at 5'22", weighing in at 5 pounds, 4 ounces, and 20 inches long. I'm very happy for Nikki, and I hope she gets some sleep in the time ahead. Next, on the substantive front, I just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you to all of the FCC staff who worked on the COVID-19 telehealth program. This is an incredibly successful program that has been near and dear to my heart. We proposed it to Congress. We supported it when it was enacted, and we immediately ran to execute it with aplomb. And the fact that we've been able to do that, to get 539 applications approved, all $200 million of funding commitments approved, is due to their efforts. And so I can't read all 150 names from across the offices and bureaus who worked on this, but I do want to thank the leadership of that team, in particular, Chris Monteith, Trent Harkrader, Ryan Palmer, Rashawn Duvall, Regina Brown, Allison Baker, Haley Steffen, and Christian Huffley. Folks out there will never know how much work they put in on top of all their other duties to make this program successful. We're already seeing some incredible potential and results from that funding that's been going out. And so thank you so much to all of you who have done all of this work inside the FCC. I also want to thank Katie Gorsak in the Office of the Media Relations for allowing us to tell the story of the COVID-19 telehealth program to the wider world. Just a great, great effort across the agency. Last but certainly not least, I did want to make a couple of brief remarks about the United States Telecommunications Training Institute, or USTTI. Many of you are probably familiar with it. If you're not, this is a public-private partnership between the United States government and American telecom and internet firms for the purpose of sharing U.S. regulatory policies and technologies with developing countries via tuition-free training. For 38 years, thanks in part to the incredible Ambassador Mickey Gardner and others, the Commission has provided formalized classroom training on topics ranging from spectrum management to broadband deployment. And these classes are taught by talented, you might say, FCC USTTI professors to benefit qualified candidates from the developing world. This has proved to be highly valued by counterpart agencies, policymakers throughout the developing world, as many students go on to leadership positions in their countries and manage close ties with the program. And I've seen that for myself in discussing with counterparts from countries like Uganda and India and Brazil about how much they have appreciated that collaboration. Now, the FCC 2020 course schedule, or USTTI 2020 course schedule was, of course, unavoidably disrupted by the pandemic, but we rose to the occasion by expeditiously developing a set of e-trainings that are ongoing until regular courses can resume. And we, of course, can't replicate the personal interaction, the repartee, the bonhomie that is provided by our regular course offerings delivered here in Washington, D.C., but These outstanding e-courses continue to provide valuable training and assistance, and that important relationship building continues strong. I want to extend our congratulations and our appreciation to all of the dedicated FCC professors. There are many, many of them because there are many classes. But I especially would like to thank Ms. Barbara Cutts of the Global Strategies and Negotiation Division of the International Bureau. Since the earliest days of the USTTI program, Barbara has been the FCC lead US FCC liaison to the program. She's worked tirelessly arranging the program, making participation possible in the developing world, and as a result, Barbara has amassed a loyal following of appreciative graduates. In its 38 years, the USTTI has graduated 10,000 men and women in 172 developing countries. That's a huge stock of talent and goodwill that I think is going to serve not just the FCC, not just the United States, but the entire world well as we seek to pursue common priorities. So thank you, Barbara, and everybody associated with the USTTI for those efforts. In addition, I'm informed that I should probably turn back to Ms. Boiselle for a brief announcement.
Sure. Thank you, Chairman Pai. So I want to make unequivocally clear that the least access item was adopted, and then also try to put to rest the question from Commissioner Rosenworcel about the effect of concurrences. So the Secretary's manual provides that a concurrence counts as an approve and is treated as a vote to adopt the item as is. And as it turns out, there are two readily available examples of items being adopted with concurrences rather than 3 approves. The 2014 net neutrality notice of proposed rulemaking had 2 approves, 1 concurrence, and 2 dissents, and was adopted as is, of course. And the 2010 open internet order had 1 approve in part, and concur in part, 1 concurrence and 2 dissents. So I apologize for not having that answer readily available when you posted it at first. I hope that settles the question.
You don't apologize. I appreciate that you got that information rapidly, but I would like you to follow up with my office and explain to me if the text of the order continues to have legal effect in light of 3 concurrences, but we can surely discuss that more offline.
Sure, we can discuss it offline. As a theoretical question, I just want to make sure that it's clear to people watching that the least access item has been adopted. Okay.
I'd just like you to follow up with me offline so we can understand if we give meaning to the text of the order going forward. So thank you, I appreciate that.
Sure.
Okay, with that, I will turn to our intrepid Madam Secretary to announce the date of the next FCC open agenda meeting.
Thank you. The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications is Thursday, August 6th, 2020.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. With that, we are adjourned.